SpongeBob began his morning with the same calm routine he followed every day, stepping outside his pineapple house into the quiet, gentle motion of Bikini Bottom's early hours. The sunlight filtered through the ocean surface above, creating soft, shifting patterns across the sand and the nearby homes. The familiar scent of seawater and the faint sound of distant bubbles created a peaceful atmosphere that set the tone for the start of his day. He felt rested and ready for whatever simple activities would fill the next hours. Today, just like on many other days, he planned to meet Patrick to spend time in Jellyfish Fields. It was one of their favorite ways to start the morning, and even if nothing special happened, the routine itself always felt comforting. Patrick was waiting near his rock when SpongeBob arrived, moving slowly and stretching as if waking up fully only in that moment. His calm expression matched the stillness of the early surroundings. Without needing to rush, the two friends headed toward the familiar path that led out of the residential area and into the open grasslands. The walk was steady and unhurried, and the gentle current of the water around them contributed to a relaxed rhythm. As they moved, small fish darted in and out of the coral along the path. Far in the distance, the faint sounds of Bikini Bottom waking up floated through the water. Someone was sweeping outside a store. A boatmobile rumbled softly as it passed by, and a few early risers moved about with their own routines. SpongeBob took in each detail with quiet interest, enjoying the slow transition from the neighborhood streets to the more open landscape of the fields. Patrick walked with a steady pace, looking around with mild curiosity, but without focusing on anything in particular. The combination of both their energies made the journey smooth and easy. Jellyfish Fields came into view as they reached the top of a small rise in the terrain. The wide expanse of soft, swaying grass created a calming scene. Jellyfish drifted lazily among the plants, their slow movements creating arcs and ripples in the water. SpongeBob noted how peaceful the area felt in the morning. The Medusa moved without urgency, and the grass swayed in response to the currents. It was the perfect place for a relaxing start to the day, and both SpongeBob and Patrick moved farther into the field until they reached a flat area they often used as their starting point. They wandered for a while, observing a few jellyfish from a distance but not actively chasing them. The morning was quieter than usual, and both of them seemed to enjoy simply walking through the grass and feeling the faint currents that push the water in gentle, constant waves. Eventually, they approached a small cluster of rocks covered in algae. SpongeBob noticed one of the rocks looked slightly different, as if it had shifted recently or had something stuck beneath it. He moved closer and inspected the edges where sand gathered in small ridges. Patrick followed him with a relaxed but curious expression. SpongeBob knelt next to the rock and brushed the sand away from its base. The water around him clouded briefly as the grains lifted and swirled before settling again. Something thin and folded was lodged underneath, slightly darker than the surrounding sand. SpongeBob slipped his hand beneath the rock and pulled the object free. It was a small, worn piece of parchment, torn unevenly along one side. The texture felt rough, as if it had spent many years buried in the sand. Both of them focused on the fragile piece, and SpongeBob slowly unfolded it. The parchment showed faint lines drawn in ink that had faded with time, yet enough remained to make out shapes and markings. A cluster of symbols was drawn near the top, while the bottom section contained part of a larger image that looked incomplete. The torn edge suggested the parchment was only one fragment of something bigger. Despite the age and worn texture, it was clear that the drawing represented a map or some kind of navigational guide. SpongeBob examined the markings carefully. Some lines resembled paths or trails, others appeared to represent rocks or reefs, and small icons labeled certain areas. Patrick leaned closer, observing with growing interest, even if he didn't fully understand the details. The symbols were unlike anything SpongeBob had seen in his everyday routines, and the more he looked, the more he felt that the parchment held something mysterious behind it. The torn edge raised the possibility of missing sections that might complete the path or reveal the purpose of the map. SpongeBob turned the parchment in his hands, studying how the lines connected. One symbol looked like an arrow pointing down toward a spot marked with a small circle. Another symbol resembled a crude drawing of a shell that might represent a familiar place in Bikini Bottom. The faded ink made interpretation difficult, but the layout implied that the map pointed toward something hidden or significant. SpongeBob felt a sense of curiosity growing rapidly as he tried to imagine who might have created such a map and how long it had remained under the rock. Patrick examined the torn side, tapping it lightly as if trying to guess where the missing pieces might be. The parchment's age and the unusual symbols suggested it belonged to a different era in Bikini Bottom's history. SpongeBob looked around the quiet field, wondering how many creatures had passed over that exact rock without realizing something important lay beneath it. The idea that they had stumbled upon a forgotten artifact made his imagination start to race, though he tried to remain focused on analyzing the content carefully. The map fragment contained no writing to clarify what it led to, so SpongeBob had to rely on interpreting the shapes. He recognized a rough outline that might correspond to part of Jellyfish Fields. Another mark resembled the curved shape of a coral structure he had seen before, though he wasn't completely certain. The parchment's faded lines made it challenging to confirm any specific landmarks. Even so, the fragment seemed to indicate a path leading from one area to another. SpongeBob turned the parchment over, but the back showed only the uneven texture of the aged material. He carefully folded it back into a more compact shape to protect it from further wear. Patrick continued staring at the small object with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew the parchment was worth keeping. Its worn and mysterious nature made it feel important in a way they couldn't yet define. They stood up from the cluster of rocks and scanned the area as if expecting to find other clues nearby. The grass moved gently in the current, and the jellyfish drifted past without paying attention to anything happening below. The peaceful surroundings made the discovery feel even more unusual, as if the calm environment intentionally concealed something hidden beneath the surface. SpongeBob walked slowly around the rock once more, pushing aside small patches of sand, but no other fragments appeared. The more he thought about it, the more he sensed that the map was not complete. The torn edge implied that the original document had been larger, and the markings seemed too fragmented to lead to a clear destination. This meant there were likely other pieces somewhere else in Bikini Bottom. The idea made SpongeBob feel both intrigued and slightly tense. The discovery of even a single fragment hinted at a bigger task ahead, something that could involve multiple locations and a deeper level of exploration. Patrick remained at his side, following his movements and occasionally glancing at the folded parchment. Even in his usual relaxed manner, something in his expression showed he understood that they had encountered a rare kind of mystery. SpongeBob held the fragment firmly, aware that the parchment was fragile, but also aware that it represented the beginning of something larger. He scanned the field once more, but the area remained unchanged and quiet, offering no immediate answers. SpongeBob slipped the folded map into a secure part of his clothing to keep it safe. The realization that they had discovered something potentially valuable or important began to settle in. He and Patrick moved away from the rock formation, walking slowly across the field with a different atmosphere surrounding them. The earlier, calm routine transformed into a sense of purpose, even if they didn't yet know what that purpose was. The fragment felt like a call toward an adventure, not something common in their usual daily activities. They continued through jellyfish fields, moving with quiet steps. SpongeBob kept thinking about the torn edges of the parchment and the missing sections. Patrick occasionally glanced at him, sensing that there was something significant happening even if he didn't fully grasp the details. The moment felt heavier than their usual morning walks, and the silence between them became a comfortable space for processing their thoughts. As they left the open grassland and moved back toward the familiar paths of Bikini Bottom, the sense of mystery followed them. SpongeBob considered different possibilities: an old pirate treasure, a hidden location from long ago, or perhaps a forgotten part of Bikini Bottom's history. The lack of clear clues only deepened his interest. The fragment felt ancient, and its discovery felt intentional in a strange way, as if it had waited for them. When they reached the outskirts of town, SpongeBob slowed his pace. The quietness of the morning had shifted into the livelier sounds of city activity. Doors opened, customers moved in and out of stores, and various residents approached their jobs and routines. SpongeBob noticed all these details, but his thoughts constantly returned to the folded parchment he carried. The discovery had introduced a new layer of excitement into the day, and even though he tried to appear calm, he felt a strong desire to examine the map again and understand its meaning. Patrick remained calm as always, but even he walked with a bit more focus than usual, occasionally glancing at the pocket where SpongeBob had placed the map. They both felt that the fragment needed to remain hidden for the moment. If anyone else learned about it too soon, the situation might become complicated, especially with certain residents who were highly motivated by the idea of treasure. SpongeBob led the way down the main street, trying to move naturally while keeping the parchment secure. The combination of their discovery and the bustling atmosphere of Bikini Bottom created a strange contrast that made SpongeBob even more aware of the significance of the moment. The treasure map fragment represented something much larger than their morning routine. It hinted at an unseen path waiting to be explored. As they continued toward their homes, SpongeBob knew this was only the beginning. The torn edge meant more fragments existed. The markings implied a hidden goal. The discovery promised an adventure that neither of them could ignore. SpongeBob felt ready to follow the map wherever it led, and Patrick, always loyal, walked beside him with steady steps, prepared for whatever journey awaited them next. SpongeBob spent the walk back toward his pineapple house thinking about the folded parchment he carried. The torn, weathered piece of map felt heavier than it should, not because of its physical weight, but because of the possibilities it represented. Patrick walked beside him with a slow, steady rhythm, occasionally glancing at SpongeBob's pocket as if checking to make sure the fragment was still there. Neither of them needed to say anything to understand that the discovery had created a new sense of anticipation. The rest of Bikini Bottom continued with its usual activities, but SpongeBob felt detached from the routine of the morning. The map had changed the tone of the day entirely. When they reached the familiar residential area, SpongeBob paused near the border of the neighborhood. Patrick stopped as well, turning toward him with the same calm expression, but with a hint of curiosity behind it. SpongeBob pulled the parchment from his pocket and unfolded it once more, keeping it shielded from the casual view of anyone passing by. The edges of the map fluttered slightly with the movement of the water around them. SpongeBob studied the faded lines again, mentally retracing the marks he had seen earlier. The torn side still bothered him. It suggested that something was missing, something essential that would make the rest of the markings clearer. SpongeBob realized that if they wanted to understand the map, they would need to find the remaining fragments. The thought filled him with determination, but along with that determination came a sense of responsibility. Bikini Bottom was full of curious individuals, and not all of them were interested in exploring for the sake of discovery. Some were motivated by other reasons, especially if the word treasure ever surfaced. SpongeBob looked around the quiet street. Residents moved casually between their homes or toward their workplaces. The area seemed peaceful and ordinary, but SpongeBob understood that this peacefulness could be deceptive. If someone like Mr. Krabs heard even a whisper about a treasure map, the situation would escalate immediately. If Plankton caught wind of it, he might twist the discovery into one of his ridiculous schemes. Even Sandy, intelligent and trustworthy as she was, might want to examine the map, and SpongeBob wasn't sure he wanted anyone else involved yet. He needed time to figure out what the fragment meant before anyone else became aware of it. He folded the parchment and tucked it deep into his pocket again, securing it firmly. Patrick watched him with quiet attention, waiting for some sort of cue. SpongeBob began walking again, this time with a more deliberate pace, as if leading Patrick somewhere with purpose. They approached SpongeBob's house and stopped near the door. The pineapple stood tall and bright, unaffected by the significance of the moment. SpongeBob, however, felt a shift inside himself. The discovery demanded careful planning, and the first step involved ensuring that no one else would find out prematurely. He motioned for Patrick to follow him behind the house, where they were less exposed to passers-by. The space behind the pineapple was shaded and rarely visited, making it an ideal place to think. SpongeBob took out the parchment once more, holding it gently but firmly. Patrick stood close, leaning slightly forward with steady interest. Even without speaking, SpongeBob's body language made his intentions clear. This discovery would remain between the two of them. It was not just a matter of excitement, it was a matter of protecting something fragile and potentially important. SpongeBob carefully unfolded the map again. The faded lines looked the same as before, but now SpongeBob examined them with a deeper sense of responsibility. He traced the markings with the tip of his finger, moving slowly across the page. The map fragment contained no direct labels, no obvious names, and no clear path that could be followed without context. It was a puzzle that needed more pieces. SpongeBob felt Patrick's presence beside him, steady and reassuring. They both understood, without needing to say it, that the map had to remain a secret. The discovery was theirs alone for now, and they would protect it together. SpongeBob folded the map again and placed it securely in his pocket, pressing the fabric lightly to ensure it was safe. He straightened his posture, feeling a quiet resolve. Patrick mirrored his stance in his relaxed, slightly clumsy way, but there was a noticeable sense of commitment in the way he stayed close. SpongeBob took a slow breath, letting the idea settle fully in his mind. They had found something important. They had found the beginning of something larger than the routine of their daily lives, and they would not let anyone interfere until they understood it better. They moved away from the back of the house and began walking again, this time with a new goal. SpongeBob wanted to find a place where they could examine the map later without attracting attention. Bikini Bottom had plenty of quiet corners, but most were visited occasionally by someone. SpongeBob wanted a spot that felt hidden, almost forgotten. They walked toward a distant part of town, passing the more populated areas with a sense of caution. SpongeBob avoided eye contact with residents, not wanting anyone to sense that he was hiding something. Patrick, surprisingly, followed his lead with an unusual level of subtlety. The two friends eventually reached a small, empty area near a cluster of large coral structures. The area was quiet and shaded, with few signs of regular activity. The current flowed gently around the coral, producing a soft sound that made the environment feel more secluded. SpongeBob examined the surroundings for a moment, satisfied that the location offered enough privacy. He imagined returning here later to analyze the map in more detail, perhaps identifying patterns that were not immediately obvious. Patrick wandered around the coral for a moment, observing the shapes and textures without touching anything. The coral structures formed natural walls that blocked the view from the main streets of Bikini Bottom. This isolation made the area ideal for secret meetings or private investigations. SpongeBob appreciated the quietness and the sense of detachment from the rest of the town. Here, the map felt safe. Here, their discovery could remain hidden from curious eyes. They stayed there for a while, not doing anything specific, simply absorbing the atmosphere and settling into the idea that they had a secret to protect. SpongeBob felt a warm sense of trust in Patrick. Despite his sometimes unpredictable behavior, Patrick understood the importance of this moment. His calm presence provided reassurance, and SpongeBob appreciated that they were facing something unknown together. The shared secret created a new connection between them, one rooted in curiosity and quiet determination. Eventually, SpongeBob decided that the map needed a more secure place than his pocket. He didn't want to risk losing it or having it accidentally discovered. He needed somewhere hidden, somewhere no one else would think to look. As they walked back toward the neighborhood, SpongeBob considered different possibilities. His house had several small compartments and hidden corners, but he needed to choose one that wouldn't be disturbed by daily routines. Patrick's rock offered very little in terms of storage, so SpongeBob dismissed that idea quickly. He continued thinking as they approached his pineapple once more. Inside the house, SpongeBob moved with purpose. He checked areas where he rarely stored anything, places that blended into the everyday environment so naturally that even he sometimes forgot they existed. After a few moments of searching, he found a small compartment near the base of one of his shelves. The compartment blended into the design of the furniture, and SpongeBob rarely opened it. It was the perfect place. He retrieved the folded map from his pocket, feeling the rough texture of the parchment one more time before placing it carefully inside the compartment. He closed it gently, ensuring it was not visibly different from its usual appearance. Patrick watched quietly, understanding that the hiding place was important. SpongeBob felt a small wave of relief knowing that the map was now safe. Even if someone entered his house unexpectedly, the compartment was unlikely to attract attention. He took a moment to stand still and absorb the significance of the act. The map was hidden. The secret was protected. He and Patrick now shared a responsibility that stretched beyond their typical daily activities. They left the house again, stepping back into the open water of the neighborhood. Bikini Bottom continued its usual rhythm, with residents moving about their day without any sign that something unusual was happening. SpongeBob walked beside Patrick with a calm but focused demeanor. The weight of their secret added a layer of purpose to their steps. Every familiar sight, every house, every store, every patch of coral felt slightly different now, as if the entire town had become part of a larger puzzle waiting to be explored. As they moved through the streets, SpongeBob imagined what the complete map might look like. He thought about the torn edges, the faint lines, and the symbols that hinted at hidden paths. If this fragment existed beneath a rock in jellyfish fields, the others could be anywhere. Buried in sand, trapped beneath old debris, or tucked away in forgotten corners of town. The possibilities were endless, and the challenge of finding the missing pieces felt both daunting and exhilarating. Patrick walked quietly beside him, occasionally looking at SpongeBob with a gentle curiosity. Even without words, SpongeBob sensed that Patrick was ready for the adventure ahead. The two of them had been through many unusual experiences together, but this one felt different. This time, they were not simply reacting to events, they were choosing to follow a path that required patience, awareness, and secrecy. The thought made SpongeBob feel more mature, as if he and Patrick were stepping into a role that extended beyond their usual playful routines. They eventually reached a point where their morning walk would typically end. But today, neither of them felt ready to return to their separate spaces. The presence of the map, even hidden safely at home, connected them to a larger purpose. SpongeBob felt a renewed sense of determination. The secret pact between them had formed naturally, without the need for spoken agreement. They understood each other. They understood the responsibility. And they understood that the journey was only beginning. As the day continued, SpongeBob felt a quiet excitement building beneath the calm surface of his thoughts. The map fragment was safe. The secret was set, and the search for the remaining pieces would begin soon. SpongeBob kept brushing off more layers of sand, and the wooden surface gradually became clearer. It had a weathered look, rough and aged, with edges softened by time. Patrick leaned closer as the last bit of sand was pushed aside, revealing a small metal latch attached to the upper edge. The latch was slightly rusted, but still intact enough to hold the lid closed. SpongeBob examined it with growing curiosity, trying to understand how something like that had ended up hidden beneath so much sand, in a place they had crossed countless times without ever noticing anything unusual. The ocean floor around them remained quiet, as if the discovery itself had calmed the current, creating a small bubble of stillness that encouraged them to continue. SpongeBob reached for the latch and moved it slowly, expecting it to resist. Instead, it shifted easily, releasing a faint scraping sound. Patrick watched every movement with a mix of surprise and anticipation, stepping just a little closer as the box finally loosened and allowed SpongeBob to lift the lid. The hinges creaked softly, a sound that felt strangely loud in the otherwise calm area. Inside the box, they did not find any glimmer of treasure or anything heavy. Instead, resting at the bottom was a rolled piece of parchment, held tightly by a small red ribbon. The parchment had an aged look, with the kind of texture that made it clear it had been sealed away for a very long time. SpongeBob paused for a moment, carefully taking in the sight before reaching inside and lifting the delicate scroll. The weight of it was surprisingly light, and the ribbon slipped slightly as he adjusted his grip. Patrick leaned in even more, trying to see what it was without touching it. SpongeBob unrolled the parchment slowly, being careful not to tear any part of it. As it opened, a detailed drawing began to appear. It showed a recognizable outline of Bikini Bottom, but not the modern one they both knew. This version had fewer structures, fewer landmarks, and many open stretches of unexplored terrain. Certain areas were marked with symbols SpongeBob had never seen before. Small icons that looked like simple illustrations but probably represented clues or warnings. A large X stood prominently near the lower corner of the map, placed over an area neither of them had ever visited. SpongeBob studied the map closely, trying to interpret its meaning. It clearly resembled a treasure map, the kind of object usually associated with grand stories or old legends that were often repeated in the background chatter of Bikini Bottom, but rarely taken seriously. Patrick stared at the large X as if it were pulling his attention toward it, almost demanding exploration. SpongeBob's gaze moved across the entire surface of the map, tracing the routes, the marked paths, and the notes scribbled in small corners. Most of the writing was faded, but some lines were still readable enough to indicate directions or mention specific features of the environment. The discovery created a subtle rush between them, an unspoken sense of excitement that neither needed to express. Their minds aligned instantly, moving from curiosity to the realization that this might lead to something far more significant than anything they had planned for the day. SpongeBob rolled the map back up carefully and secured the ribbon again, feeling the importance of protecting it. He placed it inside his pocket with a steady motion, making sure it was completely safe from the drifting sand. The area around them continued to feel unusually quiet, as if the ocean itself understood the significance of what had just been uncovered. SpongeBob and Patrick stood up, looking around to ensure no one else had witnessed the discovery. Keeping the map secret suddenly felt necessary, almost instinctual, as if sharing it too soon could disrupt whatever adventure was waiting ahead. They both turned toward the direction of Bikini Bottom, knowing they needed to return before anyone wondered what they were doing so far from their usual paths. The walk back carried a different atmosphere than the one from earlier. The fields felt less empty, as though each patch of sand and every drifting jellyfish now held potential meaning. SpongeBob replayed the image of the map in his mind repeatedly, memorizing as many details as possible. Patrick moved with a quiet excitement, occasionally glancing at SpongeBob's pocket as if verifying the map was still safe. Neither spoke, but the energy between them was clear and steady. As they approached the outer edges of Bikini Bottom, the noise of the town returned gradually. Distant voices, bubbling engines from small vehicles, and the faint clangs of early work routines reintroduced the familiar rhythm of the community. SpongeBob scanned the area naturally, making sure no one paid unusual attention to them. Patrick did the same in his own simple but effective way, looking around with exaggerated turns of his head. They blended into the surroundings with ease, becoming just two friends walking home from a morning outing. They passed by some neighbors who were already busy with their daily chores. SpongeBob greeted them with his usual friendly gestures, keeping his posture relaxed so nothing seemed unusual. Patrick followed along, imitating SpongeBob's rhythm. Even though their behavior appeared normal, inside they both carried a shared sense of purpose, aware that they were the only ones who knew about the map hidden away in SpongeBob's pocket. The closer they got to their homes, the more they felt the weight of what was to come. SpongeBob knew they needed a plan before venturing out toward the area marked by the mysterious X. Patrick clearly understood the same, even if his thought process unfolded in a much simpler way. They reached the road between their houses, pausing automatically in the same spot where they usually decided their next move. SpongeBob took a moment to check his pocket discreetly. The map remained exactly where he had placed it. The reassurance helped him relax slightly, although the excitement continued to circulate strongly. Patrick waited patiently, standing with his hands placed calmly at his sides. They both felt that the discovery had changed the tone of their day entirely, shifting it from routine to something far more unpredictable. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour, making it easier for them to linger without attracting unnecessary attention. SpongeBob looked toward Jellyfish Fields, replaying the memory of the buried box and the sensation of lifting its lid. Patrick remained still but visibly energized, thinking about the large X and what it might represent. They exchanged a silent understanding before parting for a moment, each moving toward their respective homes with the map in mind. SpongeBob entered his pineapple house slowly, making sure no one was around to notice his cautious movement. Inside, the stillness felt comforting, giving him a moment to breathe and examine the map once more. The parchment felt even older now that he observed it in the quiet of his home, with the details standing out more clearly under the soft ambient light. Patrick, meanwhile, reached his rock and settled inside with the same level of excitement, likely thinking about treasure chest, mysterious caves, or anything his imagination decided to attach to the concept of a hidden reward. Both friends carried the same unspoken decision. The map would remain their secret, at least for now. They understood that keeping it hidden was essential for the adventure to unfold properly. The sense of secrecy made everything feel more meaningful, adding a layer of anticipation that neither of them had experienced in a long time. SpongeBob examined the map again, tracing the path from Bikini Bottom to the distant area marked by the X. He studied the landmarks, the slopes, the small symbols scattered throughout the parchment. He placed the map into a secure drawer, making sure it was completely hidden. The thought of embarking on a new adventure stirred a mix of eagerness and determination. Patrick likely felt something similar, even if in a much simpler form. The entire morning had transformed into the first step of something larger, and both of them sensed it clearly. When SpongeBob finally stepped back and closed the drawer, he took a slow breath, feeling both the weight and excitement of the responsibility they now held. The treasure, whatever it was, waited somewhere beyond the familiar parts of Bikini Bottom. And even though they had no idea what challenges or surprises might be ahead, the anticipation itself was enough to push them forward into what would become one of their most memorable adventures. SpongeBob and Patrick left the quiet outskirts of Jellyfish Fields with growing determination, carrying the map securely and moving toward the next stage of their secret adventure. Their pace remained steady, but their awareness sharpened with every step. The deeper they went into Bikini Bottom's outer paths, the more they realized how challenging it would be to keep their mission hidden from the friends and neighbors who always seemed to cross their paths at the least convenient moments. The treasure map remained a secret for a reason, and both friends understood the importance of protecting it until they learned the truth behind the mysterious symbols and the large X waiting at the end of their journey. The path gradually transitioned from smooth sand into scattered rocky patches, signaling the beginning of a less traveled route. SpongeBob kept glancing at the map as they moved, verifying their direction while ensuring the parchment remained safely tucked away whenever someone approached. Patrick followed with focused enthusiasm, constantly scanning the area around them in his own simple but earnest way. Their movements grew more cautious as they reached a small rise overlooking a section of Bikini Bottom they frequently passed during ordinary days, but now perceived differently through the lens of secrecy. As they descended the slope, the familiar sound of the town reached them, soft chatter, clinking tools, and the hum of daily routines. The bustling life of Bikini Bottom continued as usual, unaware of the treasure map hidden just a short distance away. SpongeBob paused for a moment, watching the movement of residents through the coral pathways. He realized that slipping through unnoticed would be more difficult than expected. Patrick stood beside him, eager but unaware of how easily their expressions could give away their excitement. SpongeBob took a steady breath before guiding Patrick toward a narrow side path less frequented by residents. The route curved behind a series of tall coral structures and formed a natural shield from the bustling main street. As they approached the next turn, they slowed their pace, moving carefully to avoid bumping into anyone who might ask too many questions or notice the subtle signs of their hidden purpose. Despite their efforts, Bikini Bottom had a rhythm of its own, and that rhythm sometimes brought company when least expected. As they reached the edge of the coral path, SpongeBob spotted Sandy heading toward them from the opposite direction. Her steps were firm and intentional, and her pace made it clear she was on her way to a specific destination. SpongeBob reacted quickly, guiding Patrick slightly behind him to make their movements look natural. He kept his posture relaxed, even though the map felt heavier in his pocket. Sandy approached with her usual energetic stride, fully focused on whatever task she had planned for the day. SpongeBob tried to maintain a composed appearance, hoping she would simply continue on her way without paying too much attention. Patrick attempted to do the same, though his expression remained a little too excited for the situation. Sandy gave them a brief wave as she passed, acknowledging their presence without stopping. SpongeBob and Patrick responded casually, relieved as she continued down the path without showing the slightest suspicion. Once Sandy was out of sight, they resumed walking, careful to avoid drawing attention. SpongeBob felt the pressure of maintaining secrecy more intensely than before. Running into familiar faces would happen again, and each encounter carried the risk of accidentally revealing clues about the map. Patrick followed with the same unwavering enthusiasm, seemingly unaware of how close they had come to exposing their secret. The moment had passed smoothly, but SpongeBob knew they needed to be even more cautious as they approached the busier sections of Bikini Bottom. Navigating through town while hiding something important proved more challenging than either of them had expected. SpongeBob kept his thoughts steady and focused, constantly checking their surroundings and making small adjustments to their route. Patrick moved beside him with surprising discipline, perhaps sensing the seriousness of the situation more clearly now that they had encountered someone they knew. Together, they made their way through a cluster of coral pillars, hoping to briefly avoid the main routes. As they emerged from the narrow passage, they encountered Squidward heading to work, holding his clarinet case with a look that suggested he was already anticipating the long day ahead. SpongeBob stiffened slightly, instinctively shielding the pocket that held the map. Squidward walked with his usual indifferent posture, though he glanced briefly at SpongeBob and Patrick with mild suspicion, likely because they always seemed too cheerful for his taste. SpongeBob offered a polite greeting in the most casual way possible, hoping to keep the moment short. Squidward responded with minimal acknowledgement and continued walking, clearly uninterested in anything they were doing. The encounter passed without any issue, but SpongeBob felt the weight of it linger. Once Squidward disappeared from view, SpongeBob signaled for Patrick to follow him toward a quieter street. The constant need for secrecy began to change their atmosphere. They still felt the excitement of the treasure hunt, but now it blended with the responsibility of protecting the map from curious eyes. Patrick seemed to understand this, even if indirectly, because he adjusted his behavior by staying a little closer to SpongeBob, leaning in whenever he sensed movement nearby. They continued moving deeper through Bikini Bottom, attempting to avoid crossing paths with more residents. However, the layout of the town ensured that sooner or later they would run into someone else. As they approached the stretch near the Goo Lagoon shuttle stand, the Zadab, familiar figure of Mr. Krabs, came into view. He was inspecting a set of price boards for a beachside event, his eyes scanning every number with intensity. SpongeBob reacted instantly, slowing their pace and guiding Patrick subtly behind a row of tall sea plants. Patrick, who usually followed without hesitation, imitated SpongeBob's cautious movement. Mr. Krabs remained completely absorbed in the pricing boards, muttering to himself as he compared values and scribbled notes. SpongeBob and Patrick stayed still for a few moments, waiting for a safe window to slip past unnoticed. When Mr. Krabs turned to adjust another sign, SpongeBob seized the moment and moved forward, ensuring Patrick stayed low and quiet. They passed through without catching his attention, but the close call reinforced the growing difficulty of staying hidden. As they moved away from the populated area, SpongeBob felt the pressure begin to slow his steps. He realized that although the treasure map was exciting, it required them to treat the journey differently than their usual adventures. They needed to think ahead, plan their actions, and avoid unnecessary risks. Patrick still carried an unmistakable eagerness, but he also seemed to understand the seriousness that now shaped their movements. Their shared determination kept them aligned. The outskirts of Bikini Bottom soon opened into a quieter region filled with tall kelp forests and uneven terrain. Here, the noise of the town faded quickly, replaced by the soft swaying of long kelp strands and the gentle movement of sand beneath their feet. SpongeBob felt a sense of relief as the surrounding environment became calmer and less populated. The wide, open space offered more freedom to move without worrying about being watched. They followed the map's general direction, allowing the marks and symbols to guide them closer to the next landmark. SpongeBob took the map out once they were sure no one else was around, studying the faded lines carefully. The next stretch of their journey led through a winding path marked by tall coral arches and scattered clusters of rock formations. Patrick examined the map with focused interest, pointing at different parts as SpongeBob compared the drawn landscape with their surroundings. The coral arches rose above them in layered shapes, creating long shadows across the sandy floor. SpongeBob and Patrick moved through them with a renewed sense of progress. The tension of navigating through Bikini Bottom had eased, allowing the excitement of exploration to return in full. They could finally look ahead without constantly glancing over their shoulders. As they continued deeper into the quiet region, SpongeBob felt the thrill of adventure reawaken. Patrick's energy mirrored his enthusiasm, and the two friends found their rhythm again, moving together with a steady pace and shared purpose. The land around them shifted from familiar to unknown, and each turn, slope, and formation brought them closer to the mysteries hidden within the map. They walked for a long time, guided by confidence and curiosity. The ocean floor grew more rugged, with patches of uneven sand and unusual plant formations that matched the map's markings. SpongeBob kept the map in his hands now, comfortable enough to study it openly as they ventured farther from civilization. Patrick pointed occasionally at recognizable symbols, clearly beginning to understand parts of the map more than he had earlier. As they reached a natural ridge overlooking a vast stretch of unmarked territory, SpongeBob paused to take in the view. The landscape ahead looked different from anything they had explored before, less polished, more wild, and filled with potential surprises. Patrick stepped up beside him, observing the expanse with the same sense of awe. Together, they stood at the edge of the familiar world, ready to take the next step into the unknown. The treasure map remained a secret, but now the path ahead finally belonged entirely to them. The challenges of Bikini Bottom were behind them, and the mysteries of the adventure ahead unfolded silently before them. SpongeBob stepped forward first, letting his eyes adjust to the broader view that stretched beyond the ridge. The territory ahead carried a different character than the familiar regions of Bikini Bottom. The sand became rougher, shaped by stronger currents and older geological formations. Large coral pillars leaned at slight angles, worn down by time, giving the area an ancient appearance. Patrick followed behind, absorbing every detail with a combination of excitement and wonder. The new environment felt distant from their usual world, yet strangely inviting, as if it had been waiting for them long before they found the map. The ridge sloped downward in a gentle curve that led into a narrow path between two tall coral structures. SpongeBob studied the map again, comparing the layout with the terrain. The symbols on the parchment matched the surroundings more clearly now, confirming that they were on the right course. He rolled the map carefully and placed it back into his pocket as they began their descent. Patrick moved with eagerness, staying close but allowing SpongeBob to guide the way. Their footsteps created soft impressions in the sand, the only visible trace of movement in the still landscape. The path gradually widened as they progressed, revealing clusters of kelp rising tall around them. The kelp strands swayed gently, creating a rhythmic motion that made the atmosphere calming despite the unfamiliarity. SpongeBob and Patrick continued walking, listening to the subtle sounds of the environment, soft currents brushing past the coral, distant bubbles rising from underwater vents, and the faint echo of shifting sand beneath small sea creatures hidden from sight. The peacefulness helped them settle into the pace of their journey. As they advanced farther from the ridge, the sunlight filtering through the water above grew softer, shaded by the tall coral structures that bordered the path. SpongeBob glanced at the map again to identify the next key landmark. A pair of rock formations shaped like curved fins was depicted along the route. He scanned the terrain until he spotted two large rocks ahead, matching the same shape. They moved toward them, feeling reassured that they were following the correct trail. Beyond the rock formations, the ground shifted into a patchwork of sand and smooth stone. SpongeBob noticed faint grooves carved into the stone surface, as if the area had seen movement long ago. The markings were too old to identify clearly, yet they hinted at a history hidden beneath the silence. Patrick examined the grooves with fascination, running his hands lightly over the stone as they walked. The idea that others may have walked this path before added to the growing sense of significance. The map indicated a long stretch between landmarks, so SpongeBob and Patrick settled into a steady rhythm, allowing the environment to guide them. The coral structures cast long shadows that stretched across the sand in layered patterns. The path twisted gently around these formations, creating a wind-in journey that felt different from the structured layout of Bikini Bottom. The terrain's natural design forced them to navigate with more intention, adding a layer of challenge that stimulated SpongeBob's focus and Patrick's excitement. After a long stretch of walking, they reached another ridge. This one was smaller than the first, but steep enough to require careful steps. SpongeBob led the way up the incline, keeping his movements deliberate. Patrick followed without hesitation, occasionally stopping to observe the view behind them. The farther they moved from Bikini Bottom, the more the town's features faded into the distance, replaced by the expanding wilderness of the unexplored region. When they reached the top of the ridge, they paused to take in the scenery. The ridge overlooked a wide valley below, dotted with clusters of spiky coral and scattered rock outcrops. The terrain appeared more rugged than anything they had encountered so far. The map depicted this valley as a crucial part of the journey, marked by multiple small symbols representing obstacles or notable features. SpongeBob studied the parchment, slowly identifying each symbol and matching it to the scene below. Patrick waited patiently, his attention fixed on the valley with anticipation. They began their descent into the valley, recognizing that this section would require more caution. The sand became uneven, shifting under their feet with every step. SpongeBob adjusted his pace to maintain balance, and Patrick followed carefully. They made their way between clusters of spiky coral, navigating the narrow passages with slow precision. The coral formations created long, repeating patterns that almost formed natural corridors, guiding them deeper into the valley. As they continued forward, the valley floor began to level out, revealing a wider section with fewer obstacles. The current flowed more noticeably here, brushing across the sand in soft waves. SpongeBob felt the current pushing lightly against them, signaling the presence of a larger water channel nearby. According to the map, a shallow channel formed the next major landmark. He scanned the horizon until he saw the faint shimmer of water movement ahead. They approached the channel carefully, observing the gentle flow of water moving across the sandy floor. The current was shallow enough to wade through without difficulty, but it moved quickly, creating ripples that glimmered under the filtered sunlight. SpongeBob checked the map again and confirmed that crossing the channel was necessary to stay on course. He stepped into the water first, feeling the cool rush against his legs. Patrick followed, moving cautiously but comfortably. The crossing was brief, yet the sensation of moving through a natural barrier reminded them of how far they were from the familiar routines of Bikini Bottom. On the opposite side of the channel, the terrain changed once more. The valley walls gradually shrank away, opening into a broad expanse of flat land. The sand was smoother here, with fewer rocks and coral formations. SpongeBob noticed a series of faint lines imprinted in the sand, almost like trails left by long-lost travelers or natural water flows. Patrick observed the patterns with curiosity, occasionally stopping to examine them up close. SpongeBob took a moment to study the map again, realizing they were approaching the first major feature near the treasure path, a distinctive formation known as the Hollow Reef. The map depicted the Hollow Reef as a large, ring-shaped coral structure with an open center. He looked around the horizon until he spotted a formation that matched the drawing. A massive, circular structure emerged in the distance, partially obscured by drifting sand and tall kelp patches. As they drew closer, the Hollow Reef became more impressive. The coral ring stood tall, forming a natural archway into a wide, circular clearing. The interior was filled with soft sand and small patches of smooth rock, creating a calm, sheltered environment untouched by the steady currents outside. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped through the coral arch, feeling the temperature shift slightly as the Hollow Reef shielded the area from the surrounding water's movement. Inside, the silence felt different, more concentrated, more insulated. The clearing held an air of preserved history, as if it had once served as a gathering place for ancient travelers following the same map or searching for the same treasure. SpongeBob explored the clearing with thoughtful curiosity, examining the rock patterns and the coral textures along the walls. Patrick moved slowly across the sand, occasionally glancing at SpongeBob for direction. Satisfied that they had correctly reached the Hollow Reef, SpongeBob sat down in the center of the clearing to study the map again. The next portion of the trail led beyond the hollow reef toward a region labeled as the Shifting Plains. The name alone suggested that the terrain ahead would be unpredictable, perhaps shaped by moving currents or changing sand structures. Patrick sat beside him, waiting eagerly for the next step. After a few moments, they resumed their journey by exiting the hollow reef through its opposite opening. The terrain immediately shifted again, transitioning into a wide area with rolling sand waves that formed long ridges. These ridges rose and fell gently, creating a landscape that looked almost like frozen dunes. SpongeBob realized that the shifting plains likely earned their name from the unpredictable nature of these sand formations. Patrick observed the rising ridges with excitement, fascinated by the unusual terrain they were about to cross. They stepped onto the first ridge, feeling the sand shift slightly beneath their feet. SpongeBob tested the stability before continuing, ensuring Patrick could follow safely. The ridges stretched far into the distance, forming an uneven path that required careful movement. The currents created subtle vibrations through the sand, giving the impression that the ground could shift at any moment. SpongeBob maintained a steady pace, guiding them toward a cluster of coral pillars that marked the end of this region on the map. As they navigated the shifting plains, the challenge of balancing on the rolling ridges added a new layer of adventure to their journey. Patrick adapted quickly, finding his own rhythm as he followed SpongeBob across the shifting ground. The terrain forced them to move deliberately, taking slow steps and adjusting their balance with each change in elevation. Even though the process demanded focus, both friends felt invigorated by the unfamiliar challenge. With time and patience, they reached the cluster of coral pillars that stood like silent guardians at the edge of the plains. SpongeBob paused, taking a moment to review the map once more. The next stage of their journey led through a narrow canyon known as the Whispering Hollow. The canyon's name intrigued them, suggesting that the currents created distinctive sounds as they flowed through the rock formations. As they continued forward, the entrance to the Whispering Hollow soon came into view. Two towering rock walls framed a long, narrow passage leading deeper into the unknown. SpongeBob felt a growing sense of anticipation as they stepped inside, ready to discover what secrets the canyon held. The journey had carried them far from home, but each step brought them closer to the treasure and closer to uncovering the truth behind the mysterious map. SpongeBob and Patrick entered the Whispering Hollow with cautious steps, feeling the cool shadow cast by the towering rock walls on either side. The narrow passage funneled the currents into a soft hum that seemed to surround them, echoing faintly along the stone surfaces. Each movement they made was accompanied by subtle whispers of water brushing against the walls, a sound both calming and strange. SpongeBob felt the weight of the map in his pocket as he guided Patrick forward, realizing that every detail of this hidden canyon could affect their progress. The ground beneath them was uneven, with small ridges and depressions carved into the rock by years of water movement. SpongeBob adjusted his balance constantly, careful not to slip on the slick surfaces, while Patrick followed closely, stepping lightly but with occasional stumbles that SpongeBob helped steady. The walls of the canyon were covered in patterns of algae and coral, creating textures that shifted with the water's motion. Tiny bubbles floated up from hidden crevices, shimmering briefly before disappearing, adding to the otherworldly atmosphere of the hollow. As they moved deeper, the passage narrowed in some areas, forcing them to duck under overhanging rocks or step sideways around protrusions. The map indicated that the canyon would eventually open into a wider chamber, and SpongeBob focused on keeping the path aligned with the symbols he had memorized. Patrick glanced occasionally at the rock walls, his curiosity piqued by the unusual shapes and patterns. Each twist and turn of the hollow seemed like a small test, a way to gauge their awareness and coordination. The currents through the hollow grew slightly stronger in certain sections, creating small ripples across the sand and producing a gentle tug against their movements. SpongeBob adjusted his steps accordingly, taking slightly wider strides to maintain stability. Patrick imitated him instinctively, following the same rhythm. The map's markings became crucial now, as each symbol seemed to correspond to a subtle change in the canyon, differences in sand color, rock texture, or the faint presence of bubbles that hinted at hidden passages. After a long stretch of careful navigation, they reached a part of the hollow where the walls curved inward, forming a shallow alcove. SpongeBob paused to examine the markings etched into the rock. Some of these symbols were similar to the ones on the map, but others appeared worn and faded. The alcove felt like a place of quiet observation, as if the currents themselves were directing their attention to this point. Patrick wandered briefly into the space, feeling the change in the water's motion as it swirled gently around the rock formations. SpongeBob studied the alcove carefully. The etched symbols were subtle, yet the alignment with the map suggested that this was an important marker. The hollow seemed to guide them silently, confirming that their path was correct. Patrick crouched down to examine a small patch of sand that had settled differently from the surrounding area, creating faint impressions that hinted at movement long ago. SpongeBob observed him with a calm sense of satisfaction, realizing that both the map and the natural features of the hollow were working together to lead them onward. They continued forward, leaving the alcove behind. The canyon opened into a wider corridor, allowing them to move more freely. The currents remained present, but gentler, brushing across their bodies and carrying with them the faint scent of deeper waters beyond. SpongeBob adjusted his pace, feeling the hollow's rhythm as they proceeded. Patrick followed with an energy that balanced excitement and focus, responding naturally to the subtle guidance of SpongeBob's movements. The walls of the corridor displayed more intricate patterns of coral and stone. Some of the formations created archways overhead, while others curved around them, forming natural tunnels that led deeper into the hollow. SpongeBob paused occasionally to verify their position using the map, tracing the symbols with his finger and ensuring alignment with the physical features. Patrick mirrored his actions, not entirely understanding each detail but sensing the significance of the moment. As they advanced, they noticed changes in the lighting. Sunlight filtering through the water above shifted subtly, creating moving patterns on the canyon floor. The shadows cast by the coral and rock formations seemed to dance along with the currents. SpongeBob felt a calming rhythm emerge from this interplay of light and water, allowing him to move with greater confidence. Patrick responded similarly, stepping more carefully yet with growing curiosity, as if the hollow itself encouraged their exploration. Eventually, the corridor opened into a broader chamber, where the walls arched high and the floor became smoother. The currents here formed a gentle swirling motion, creating a soft, circular pattern in the sand. SpongeBob recognized this as a key landmark from the map, a natural arena within the hollow that marked the transition to the next stage of the journey. Patrick moved slowly across the sand, observing the swirl pattern with fascination, occasionally reaching down to touch the surface lightly as the current shifted around his fingers. The chamber was larger than either of them had anticipated. The walls towered overhead, covered in textures and patterns that suggested centuries of underwater history. Small fish and hidden creatures moved quietly along the edges, unbothered by the presence of SpongeBob and Patrick. The silence of the space was profound, broken only by the subtle sound of currents flowing through the cavern. SpongeBob felt a growing sense of awe, recognizing the uniqueness of this environment. Patrick's excitement mirrored this sense of wonder, though he approached each corner and formation with the innocence and curiosity of someone discovering something entirely new. SpongeBob and Patrick continued through the chamber, following the path indicated on the map. The markings suggested that the hollow would soon lead them toward an exit into an open area, where the next landmark awaited. SpongeBob traced the route with his finger, memorizing each curve and symbol. Patrick occasionally pointed at features that matched the drawings, reinforcing SpongeBob's observations. Together, they moved with a coordinated effort, relying on the map and the natural cues of the environment. As they neared the chamber's far edge, the walls began to thin, allowing more light to filter through the water. The currents became gentler, flowing in the direction of the opening ahead. SpongeBob stepped forward cautiously, signaling Patrick to follow. The sensation of moving toward a new area brought a mixture of relief and anticipation. The hollow had been challenging, yet it had also been instructive, teaching them to observe and adapt to the environment with patience and focus. Finally, the corridor opened fully, revealing a gently sloping passage that led into an open section beyond. The sunlight, filtering through the water above, became brighter, illuminating the sand and coral in soft, shimmering patterns. SpongeBob paused to take in the view, feeling a quiet satisfaction at having successfully navigated the whispering hollow. Patrick stood beside him, gazing at the landscape ahead with wide eyes and an evident sense of accomplishment. The open area ahead represented the next phase of the journey. The terrain was marked on the map as a transitional zone leading toward the hollow reef and eventually the shifting plains. SpongeBob studied the map carefully, noting the details that corresponded to the visible environment. Patrick remained close, ready to follow wherever SpongeBob led. The discovery of this open section felt like a small victory, a confirmation that their careful navigation and attention to detail had paid off. They took their first steps into the open space, feeling the gentle currents flow across their bodies. The sand beneath their feet was smooth, yet subtle ridges suggested that movement would need to remain attentive. SpongeBob adjusted his pace, leading the way with deliberate steps. Patrick followed, his energy balanced by careful observation. Together, they moved confidently, aware that the adventure had already demanded their full attention and would continue to do so. The whispering hollow had challenged them, tested their focus, and revealed secrets hidden within the canyon walls. As they looked ahead, SpongeBob realized that the journey was far from over. The path toward the treasure would continue to demand observation, patience, and determination. Patrick's presence remained steady, a constant reminder that they were facing the unknown together. The shared experience of navigating the hollow strengthened their resolve, preparing them for the obstacles and discoveries that lay ahead. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped out from the whispering hollow into the wide expanse that stretched ahead. The terrain immediately changed, presenting a landscape filled with rolling sand waves and uneven ridges. This was the shifting plains, as the map had labeled them. The sand formed long, undulating slopes that rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost alive, subtly moving with the currents. Each step required careful balance, as a misstep could send them sliding down a ridge or disturb the delicate surface, leaving a trace that could alert anyone watching from a distance. The sunlight filtered through the water, creating shifting patterns across the plains. SpongeBob adjusted his movements to follow the safest path, choosing ridges that offered stability and avoiding areas where the sand appeared loose or unstable. Patrick, slightly more reckless but equally determined, followed closely, stepping carefully on SpongeBob's cues. The two friends moved together with a rhythm, alternating between cautious observation and deliberate steps, gradually learning the pattern of the shifting ground beneath them. The plains were not empty. Small coral clusters and scattered rocks interrupted the flowing patterns of sand, forming natural markers that SpongeBob used to check their progress. Tiny sea creatures scuttled across the ridges, creating fleeting traces of movement before disappearing into the soft sand. SpongeBob noted each detail, understanding that these subtle features could help them navigate when the ridges and valleys became more repetitive. Patrick, drawn by curiosity, occasionally paused to watch the creatures, his wonder complementing SpongeBob's careful attention. As they advanced, the landscape began to show hints of color in unexpected places. Patches of darker sand formed irregular patterns, some resembling faint symbols. SpongeBob paused to examine one cluster, tracing it with a finger and comparing it to the markings on the map. The patterns suggested a continuation of the path, subtle cues left by the environment itself. Patrick leaned in, pointing at a set of markings that aligned with the map, reinforcing their sense of direction. Together, they felt reassured that they were on the correct course. The shifting plains demanded more than just careful stepping. Certain areas contained hidden dips in the sand that could destabilize them if not noticed. SpongeBob carefully scanned each ridge before moving forward, anticipating potential pitfalls. Patrick adjusted his pace to mirror SpongeBob's observations, learning to sense the subtle changes in terrain. The process required patience, but the slow, deliberate movement allowed them to traverse the plains without incident. As they continued, the ridges grew taller, creating small hills that rose above the surrounding sand. SpongeBob led the way up the first slope, feeling the shifting grains slide beneath his feet. Patrick followed, pausing occasionally to balance himself against the incline. From the top, the view stretched across a wide area of undulating sand waves, revealing a distant cluster of coral that marked the next landmark. The sight filled them with renewed energy, reminding them that every step brought them closer to the treasure hidden at the end of the map. The wind of the underwater currents played across the plains, occasionally lifting loose sand and sending it swirling in miniature clouds. SpongeBob adjusted his movements to avoid the drifting particles, keeping the map safely tucked away in his pocket. Patrick, captivated by the movement, reached out to touch the floating grains, laughing softly as the currents pulled them away. SpongeBob smiled at his friend's enthusiasm, but kept focus on the path ahead. The combination of playful wonder and careful observation made their journey both challenging and enjoyable. The plains gradually shifted toward a more uneven region, where the ridges became steeper and the valleys deeper. SpongeBob guided Patrick carefully down a slope, testing the sand for stability before each step. Patrick moved with increasing caution, learning to follow SpongeBob's lead. The shadows cast by the taller ridges created natural markers, helping them gauge distance and orientation. SpongeBob noted each pattern, imagining how it aligned with the remaining path indicated on the map. Small pools of water appeared in the valleys, reflecting the light filtering from above. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped around these pools, careful not to disturb the water or lose their footing. The reflections created subtle illusions of depth, making the terrain appear different from reality. SpongeBob adjusted his path to account for the distortions, leading Patrick along a safer route. Patrick occasionally glanced at the shimmering water, fascinated by the way it danced with the sunlight, and continued following SpongeBob's lead without hesitation. Midway across the plains, they encountered a particularly large ridge that seemed to span the width of their path. SpongeBob paused at the base, examining the incline and planning the safest route up. The sand was loose and shifting, requiring careful steps to maintain balance. Patrick followed, testing each foot placement before committing his weight. Together, they ascended slowly, their movements synchronized to navigate the ridge without sliding. Reaching the top brought a sense of relief and accomplishment, as the view ahead revealed a more stable region with smaller ridges and occasional coral formations. The stable section offered a brief respite. SpongeBob and Patrick walked with less strain, moving at a steadier pace. The terrain was smoother, with fewer abrupt changes in elevation. SpongeBob took out the map for a moment, reviewing the next portion of the route. The map indicated a narrowing passage that would lead them toward the next major landmark, a series of tall coral towers partially obscured by drifting sand and kelp. SpongeBob noted the alignment, folding the map carefully and securing it back in his pocket. As they approached the towers, the plains became slightly more rugged, with irregular sand formations rising to meet the base of the coral. SpongeBob guided Patrick through the gaps, using the natural openings as a pathway. The towers loomed above them, their height casting long shadows that stretched across the sand waves. SpongeBob studied the shapes, recognizing subtle patterns that matched the map's symbols. Patrick moved with growing confidence, occasionally stepping on small outcroppings to get a better view of the surroundings. Between the towers, the terrain became more complex, with interwoven ridges and shallow dips that required careful navigation. SpongeBob paused frequently, scanning the sand and adjusting their path to avoid unstable sections. Patrick followed, learning to anticipate changes in elevation and shifting his weight accordingly. The process demanded patience and attention, but both felt a sense of satisfaction with every successful step. Small currents of water flowed through the gaps between towers, creating subtle ripples in the sand. SpongeBob used these currents as guides, following the direction of flow to maintain orientation. Patrick observed the patterns, noticing how the water subtly indicated changes in terrain. Together, they moved steadily through the towers, relying on the map, the currents, and each other's observations to navigate the complex landscape. Reaching the far side of the towers, they found the shifting plains gradually leveling out. The ridges became smaller, and the sand smoothed beneath their feet. SpongeBob and Patrick paused to take in the expanse ahead, noting that the next segment of their journey led toward a cluster of unusual coral formations depicted on the map. These formations mark the transition into the next stage, promising new challenges and discoveries. SpongeBob adjusted his posture, feeling a growing sense of anticipation for the adventures yet to come. They began moving across the leveled area, stepping carefully over subtle ridges and depressions. SpongeBob maintained awareness of the map, using it to identify features that indicated the correct direction. Patrick followed closely, occasionally looking around with wide-eyed wonder. The plains, though calmer now, still carried a subtle sense of motion beneath the surface, reminding them that their journey required constant attention. The shifting plains had tested their patience, coordination, and focus. Each step had demanded careful observation and adjustment. Yet, the experience had also strengthened their teamwork and deepened their sense of connection. SpongeBob and Patrick moved with growing confidence, knowing that their efforts were bringing them closer to the treasure and the adventures that awaited beyond the plains. As they reached the edge of the leveled area, SpongeBob spotted the first hints of the next, landmark coral towers rising like guardians at the boundary of the plains. The structures matched the illustrations on the map precisely, providing a clear target for the next stage. Patrick pointed eagerly, stepping forward with excitement tempered by careful observation. SpongeBob followed, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Together, they prepared to leave the shifting plains behind and enter the next chapter of their journey, ready to face whatever challenges awaited in the unfamiliar territory beyond. SpongeBob and Patrick approached the coral towers with a mixture of excitement and caution. The formations rose high above the surrounding sand, their surfaces textured with ridges and holes that suggested the passage of time and the subtle shaping power of ocean currents. The towers were not uniform. Some leaned at slight angles, while others formed natural arches and narrow corridors between them. SpongeBob studied the map, noting that this was the exact section marked as a transitional zone leading toward the next stage of their journey. Patrick's eyes widened as he observed the towers, clearly sensing the importance of the structures in guiding them forward. The sand at the base of the towers was uneven, scattered with small rocks and coral fragments. SpongeBob led the way, carefully testing each step before committing his weight. Patrick followed closely, occasionally stepping on slightly higher coral pieces to gain a better view of the formations ahead. The path between the towers required precise movement. Missteps could result in slipping or disturbing the fragile coral, which might reveal traces of their passage. SpongeBob maintained a steady rhythm, adjusting his pace based on the shifting sand and the currents brushing across their legs. As they moved deeper between the towers, the passages narrowed in certain sections, forming natural tunnels with walls so close that they had to walk in single file. SpongeBob guided Patrick through each gap with deliberate care, paying attention to the map to ensure they were following the correct route. Patrick, though slightly larger, managed to move without difficulty, relying on SpongeBob's lead and the subtle guidance of the surrounding formations. The interplay of shadows created by the towers and filtered sunlight added an ever-changing layer of complexity to the visual environment, making navigation both challenging and captivating. The currents through this area were stronger in places, creating small swirls that shifted loose sand and small particles. SpongeBob noticed these subtle patterns and used them to anticipate changes in footing, guiding Patrick along safer paths. Patrick's curiosity was apparent as he paused occasionally to examine formations in detail, tracing the textures of the coral with his hands. SpongeBob encouraged these pauses quietly, understanding that Patrick's observations often helped identify safe passages or hidden landmarks that aligned with the map. Between towers, the terrain became more intricate. Natural bridges formed overhead, connecting structures and creating multiple potential routes. SpongeBob analyzed each path carefully, considering which route would keep them on course while minimizing risk. Patrick followed obediently, stepping through narrow spaces and over small gaps. Their movement required continuous attention, but the process reinforced their teamwork, blending SpongeBob's careful analysis with Patrick's intuitive approach to exploration. The towers themselves displayed a variety of textures and colors. Some surfaces were smooth and polished by the flow of water, while others were jagged and covered in algae or small barnacles. SpongeBob observed these differences, recognizing that each unique feature served as a natural marker corresponding to the symbols on the map. Patrick, while less precise in his observations, still contributed by noticing changes in the shapes and colors of the towers, helping SpongeBob confirm their position and direction. As they progressed, the towers began to form small alcoves and open spaces, creating natural chambers within the complex. The sound of flowing water echoed softly within these spaces, adding a serene rhythm to their steps. SpongeBob and Patrick moved carefully through each chamber, taking the time to examine the terrain and compare it with the map. Each chamber appeared to contain subtle clues, small depressions in the sand, faint scratches on the coral, and occasional clusters of unusual shells that guided them along the intended route. The map indicated that a central cluster of towers contained the next key landmark, a formation shaped like a spiral rising from the sand. SpongeBob led Patrick toward the center of the coral complex, navigating carefully through the winding corridors. The spiral structure gradually came into view, its shape unmistakable against the backdrop of taller towers. SpongeBob paused to appreciate the natural beauty and precision of the formation, noting that it had been formed over countless years by the movement of water and sand. Patrick's excitement was palpable as he approached the spiral, clearly sensing that they were on the right path. The ground surrounding the spiral was smoother than the rest of the towers, with small ridges and shallow dips providing subtle guidance for their steps. SpongeBob and Patrick moved cautiously toward the spiral's base, noting the intricate textures on the coral surface. The spiral tower's center created a small opening through which faint currents flowed, producing a gentle bubbling sound. SpongeBob recognized that this feature could serve as a waypoint, confirming their alignment with the map. As they circled the spiral, SpongeBob traced their progress against the symbols on the map, making mental notes of each formation and its relation to the next stage. Patrick observed nearby openings and minor pathways, occasionally suggesting subtle deviations that SpongeBob considered and incorporated if they aligned with the intended course. The coordination between them was seamless, blending SpongeBob's analytical approach with Patrick's instinctive observations, allowing them to navigate the complex terrain efficiently. Emerging from the spiral, the towers gradually decreased in height, opening into a narrow corridor that led toward the final edge of the coral tower region. SpongeBob studied the transition carefully, noting subtle changes in sand, texture, and current direction that indicated the approach to the next major landmark. Patrick followed closely, stepping lightly across uneven ground and observing the flow of currents to anticipate upcoming obstacles. The final stretch of the towers presented a combination of narrow passages, small ridges, and minor drops in the terrain. SpongeBob led the way with deliberate attention, guiding Patrick through each section while maintaining awareness of the map. The currents shifted occasionally, creating gentle swirls that altered the feel of the sand beneath their feet. SpongeBob adjusted their pace accordingly, ensuring stability and minimizing the risk of leaving traces that could reveal their presence. As they exited the coral towers, the landscape beyond opened into a broader area with scattered coral formations and patches of smooth sand. The map indicated that this region served as a transition zone, preparing them for the next challenging segment of their journey. SpongeBob paused for a moment, taking in the view and reflecting on the successful navigation of the towers. Patrick, full of energy and curiosity, glanced back at the towering structures they had just crossed, recognizing the significance of their accomplishment. The exit from the towers marked a turning point in their adventure. SpongeBob felt a growing sense of anticipation for the challenges ahead, knowing that each stage had brought them closer to the treasure. Patrick's enthusiasm mirrored this feeling, tempered by the shared understanding that careful observation and teamwork were essential. Together, they stepped into the new area, prepared to face whatever awaited beyond the coral towers. The transition zone was relatively calm compared to the intricate passages they had just navigated, providing a brief opportunity to regain steady rhythm and focus. SpongeBob and Patrick moved forward cautiously, observing the terrain and the surrounding currents. The smooth patches of sand allowed for quicker movement, while scattered coral clusters served as reference points to maintain orientation. SpongeBob reviewed the map in his mind, identifying the next series of formations and potential obstacles they would encounter. As they advanced, the currents shifted subtly, creating gentle ripples across the sand. SpongeBob adjusted their steps, guiding Patrick over uneven surfaces and around minor depressions. Patrick's focus was steady, his attention drawn both to SpongeBob's guidance and the natural patterns in the environment. The interplay of observation and instinct allowed them to move efficiently through the transition zone. The scattered coral formations increased in frequency as they approached the edge of the next major region. SpongeBob recognized that these clusters would require careful navigation to avoid disturbing the sand or creating noticeable traces. Patrick followed with precision, mirroring SpongeBob's steps and maintaining close alignment. These coordination between them had grown stronger with each stage of the journey, reinforcing their ability to tackle increasingly complex terrain. At the far edge of the transition zone, SpongeBob spotted the entrance to a new area depicted on the map as a wider, open region filled with irregular coral mounds and subtle sand waves. This area promised new challenges and discoveries, marking the next chapter in their adventure. SpongeBob adjusted his pace, leading Patrick forward with deliberate steps. Patrick followed with steady excitement, ready to continue the journey and explore the mysteries that lay ahead. The coral towers receded behind them, their towering forms now visible only in the distance. SpongeBob and Patrick paused briefly, taking note of their progress and the intricate journey they had just completed. The experience of navigating the towers had strengthened their confidence and deepened their understanding of the map's guidance. Together, they stepped into the new open region, prepared for the next stage of the adventure and the secrets that awaited within. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into the open region beyond the coral towers, their eyes adjusting to the new expanse filled with scattered coral mounds and gentle sand waves. The area appeared calm at first glance, but SpongeBob knew that the map hinted at a hidden passage somewhere within this territory, a subtle deviation in the terrain that could easily be overlooked. He moved deliberately, scanning the patterns of the sand and the distribution of coral, searching for any features that aligned with the symbols marked on the parchment. The scattered mounds created a natural rhythm across the landscape, offering both obstacles and guidance. SpongeBob led the way through narrow gaps between the coral, ensuring Patrick followed closely. Patrick, full of curiosity, occasionally paused to examine an unusual coral formation or a small shell embedded in the sand. SpongeBob encouraged these pauses quietly, understanding that Patrick's observations could reveal subtle details he might have missed. The interplay between careful attention and natural curiosity kept their progress steady and intentional. As they moved further into the region, the sand began to shift more noticeably. Gentle currents created small ripples that changed the surface texture with every step. SpongeBob adjusted their movements, testing each ridge before placing weight, while Patrick mimicked the careful steps with surprising precision. The map suggested that the hidden passage was nearby, but its entrance was not marked explicitly, requiring them to combine observation with intuition to locate it. After a long stretch of walking, SpongeBob noticed a slight indentation in the sand between two coral mounds. The depression was subtle, partially obscured by drifting particles and small fragments of coral. He paused to examine it more closely, tracing the edges with his hand. The pattern aligned perfectly with the symbol on the map, indicating a concealed entrance into the hidden passage. Patrick leaned in, eyes wide with anticipation, understanding instinctively that they had discovered the first secret of this new stage. The entrance was narrow, just wide enough for both to pass through comfortably. SpongeBob led Patrick carefully, stepping into the shallow gap and feeling the walls of coral brush against his sides. The passage immediately felt different from the open region they had just crossed. The water was cooler and slightly darker, and the surrounding coral created an enclosed environment that muffled distant sounds. SpongeBob felt the importance of moving carefully, knowing that even the smallest mistake could compromise their progress. The ground inside the passage was uneven, with small ridges and depressions carved into the sand. SpongeBob adjusted his pace, testing each step for stability. Patrick followed, mimicking SpongeBob's movements while occasionally leaning forward to peer into crevices. The passage narrowed and widened intermittently, forming a natural corridor that twisted gently through the coral. SpongeBob studied the patterns on the walls and the floor, comparing them to the map and noting how each turn aligned with the hidden route. Subtle currents flowed through the passage, creating miniature swirls that moved particles of sand and small shells across the floor. SpongeBob observed these flows carefully, using them as indicators of potential obstacles or changes in the terrain. Patrick reached down occasionally to watch the particles move, fascinated by the patterns they formed. SpongeBob found that combining the map with the natural signs in the environment allowed them to navigate the hidden passage efficiently, even without explicit markings. As they moved deeper, the passage curved sharply, creating a natural separation between different sections of the region. SpongeBob guided Patrick carefully around the turn, keeping attention on the stability of the sand beneath their feet. The walls of coral were textured and uneven, providing both handholds and subtle clues about the direction they should follow. Small holes in the walls allowed faint light to filter through, creating soft beams that illuminated portions of the passage and highlighted features that corresponded to the map. After a long stretch, the corridor opened briefly into a small chamber. The sand here was smoother, and tiny streams of water flowed gently along the edges, creating faint ripples. SpongeBob paused to examine the area, noticing slight depressions and subtle formations that matched symbols on the map. Patrick moved across the sand, observing the flowing water and occasional bubbles rising from crevices. The chamber felt like a natural checkpoint within the hidden passage, confirming that they were on the correct route. The chamber's floor contained small ridges that created gentle slopes, requiring careful navigation. SpongeBob stepped carefully, signaling Patrick to follow the safest path. The currents within the chamber were mild but noticeable, occasionally shifting small sand particles that could affect footing. Patrick adjusted quickly, learning to anticipate the changes and maintain balance alongside SpongeBob. Together, they moved with steady coordination, using both observation and intuition to maintain alignment with the map. Exiting the chamber, the passage narrowed again, forming a winding corridor that led deeper into the hidden region. SpongeBob observed the patterns of light filtering through small gaps in the coral walls, noting how the brightness changed with each turn. Patrick followed closely, his attention drawn to both the shifting light and the subtle textures on the walls. Each curve of the passage required them to adjust their movements carefully, ensuring they remained on course and avoided disturbing the sand or coral. The hidden passage contained occasional small alcoves, some filled with tiny shells or unusual coral formations. SpongeBob paused briefly at each alcove, examining the features for alignment with the map. Patrick explored the alcoves with curiosity, noticing details SpongeBob might have overlooked. These small deviations served as both natural resting points and markers for orientation within the passage. SpongeBob recognized that the environment itself provided guidance if observed carefully. The passage twisted and turned, occasionally widening into short stretches of open space before narrowing again. SpongeBob maintained focus, using the map to anticipate each change in width and curvature. Patrick followed, adapting to the rhythm of the corridor and responding to SpongeBob's cues. The interplay between map guidance and natural observation allowed them to move efficiently, even through the most intricate sections. Midway through this stage, SpongeBob noticed a subtle change in the texture of the walls and the floor. The sand appeared slightly darker, and the coral surfaces smoother, as if the environment signaled the approach of the next major landmark. He signaled Patrick to slow down and observe carefully. Together, they adjusted their pace, moving with deliberate steps and maintaining attention to the patterns of the passage. Each movement was small but precise, ensuring their safety and preserving the hidden nature of their route. As they continued, the passage began to ascend gently, leading toward a faint opening visible at the far end. Light filtered through this distant gap, casting soft patterns on the surrounding coral. SpongeBob felt a growing sense of anticipation, recognizing that the end of the hidden passage approached. Patrick's excitement mirrored SpongeBob's focus, tempered by the care required to navigate the delicate terrain. Each step brought them closer to the next stage of their journey, and the promise of new discoveries lay ahead. The final section of the hidden passage included narrow ridges and shallow depressions in the sand, demanding heightened attention. SpongeBob tested each step, guiding Patrick along the safest route. The subtle currents created gentle disturbances in the sand, signaling areas to avoid or move cautiously across. Patrick followed closely, learning to anticipate these subtle changes and maintain balance. Together, they reached the threshold of the passage, the faint light ahead signaling the transition to an open area. Emerging from the hidden passage, SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into a wider expanse of sand and scattered coral mounds. The sunlight filtered clearly through the water, illuminating the terrain and highlighting the next region marked on the map. SpongeBob paused briefly, taking note of the transition and observing the features of the surrounding environment. Patrick followed, his enthusiasm evident as he stepped onto the more open ground. The passage had been challenging, testing their observation, coordination, and patience, but it had also strengthened their teamwork and confidence. The hidden passage had served its purpose, providing a protected route through the intricate terrain and guiding them toward the next landmark. SpongeBob studied the map once more, identifying the next stage of the journey and the features they would encounter. Patrick looked around, absorbing the details of the landscape and preparing to continue forward. Together, they stepped fully into the open expanse, ready to face the challenges and discoveries that awaited beyond the hidden passage. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into the open expanse at the end of the hidden passage, their eyes immediately drawn to the dense arrangement of coral structures ahead. The map had labeled this area as the Coral Labyrinth, a complex maze of towering coral walls and intricate passages. SpongeBob felt a surge of anticipation. The labyrinth promised both challenge and discovery, a test of observation, patience, and collaboration. Patrick mirrored the excitement, bouncing slightly with each step, eager to explore the twisting corridors and hidden corners. The labyrinth's entrance was deceptively simple, a narrow gap between two tall coral formations. SpongeBob led the way, carefully adjusting each step on the uneven sand. Patrick followed closely, moving with cautious curiosity. As they entered, the walls rose around them, casting long shadows that shifted subtly with the sunlight filtering through the water. The passage immediately split into multiple corridors, each winding in a slightly different direction. SpongeBob consulted the map, identifying the correct initial path and mentally noting reference points along the walls to prevent disorientation. The corridors of the labyrinth were narrow in some places and wide in others. Small crevices and natural alcoves lined the walls, housing tiny shells and hidden sea creatures. SpongeBob paused occasionally to examine these features, using them as markers to confirm alignment with the map. Patrick explored lightly, moving his hands across the coral textures and observing how light and shadow played across the surfaces. The labyrinth felt alive, the water currents flowing through each corridor creating a soft hum that added both serenity and tension to their progress. Navigating the maze required constant attention. Certain passages curved subtly, forcing SpongeBob to slow his pace to avoid misalignment with the map. Patrick adjusted his movements to mirror SpongeBob, learning to sense changes in the width and height of the corridors. The sand beneath their feet shifted occasionally, creating small challenges to balance and foot placement. SpongeBob moved deliberately, testing each step before advancing, while Patrick followed closely, observing SpongeBob's approach and adapting instinctively. Deeper into the labyrinth, the corridors became more intricate. Multiple paths branched off from the main route, each lined with irregular coral formations and small ridges in the sand. SpongeBob traced the map's symbols carefully, using both the drawn landmarks and the natural features to determine which routes were safe and correct. Patrick followed, pausing to study the surroundings and notice subtle cues that aligned with the map. Together, they formed a rhythm of exploration, blending SpongeBob's analytical approach with Patrick's intuitive curiosity. The labyrinth contained occasional open spaces, small chambers formed by coral clusters. These spaces offered a brief respite from the twisting corridors, but they also required careful observation. SpongeBob examined the chamber floors for subtle markings and depressions, checking for alignment with the map. Patrick moved through the space with fascination, examining small coral outcroppings and the patterns of light filtering in from above. The combination of attention and exploration allowed them to maintain direction while absorbing the unique environment. Currents flowed through the labyrinth in irregular patterns, shifting small particles of sand and creating gentle ripples across the floor. SpongeBob noticed these movements and used them to gauge the stability of each step. Patrick occasionally reached down to watch the shifting sand, fascinated by the miniature whirlpools forming along the corridors. SpongeBob found that observing the currents provided additional guidance, helping them anticipate subtle changes in terrain and maintain alignment with the map. As they progressed, the walls of the labyrinth grew taller, narrowing certain corridors and creating natural arches overhead. SpongeBob adjusted his movements, ensuring Patrick could pass comfortably without disturbing the delicate coral. The interplay of shadows and light became more pronounced, providing both challenges and cues for navigation. SpongeBob traced the map frequently, mentally matching each twist and turn to the symbols and patterns depicted, reinforcing their progress through the maze. Midway through the labyrinth, they reached a chamber with multiple exits, each appearing equally plausible. SpongeBob studied the map carefully, identifying subtle features in the corridor walls that indicated the correct path. Patrick observed nearby alcoves and small formations, occasionally pointing out details that supported SpongeBob's decision. Together, they chose the safest route, moving cautiously through the narrow passages and maintaining constant awareness of the surrounding terrain. The corridors twisted and curved in complex patterns, creating a sense of disorientation despite the careful navigation. SpongeBob relied on both the map and the natural landmarks, distinct coral textures, small ridges in the sand, and subtle changes in current flow to maintain direction. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's movements, adjusting his steps to navigate tight turns and uneven surfaces. Their shared focus and teamwork ensured steady progress through the most intricate sections of the labyrinth. The labyrinth's chambers varied in size and complexity. Some were small, enclosed spaces with limited visibility, while others were larger, allowing currents and light to create shifting patterns on the floor. SpongeBob paused in these areas, observing the environment and noting reference points for the next segment. Patrick explored carefully, running his hands along coral surfaces and examining the small openings between structures. The combination of deliberate observation and natural curiosity allowed them to advance without error. Deeper into the maze, SpongeBob noticed subtle changes in the sand's texture and the coral's coloration. The map indicated that these variations marked the approach to a significant feature within the labyrinth. SpongeBob slowed their pace, guiding Patrick carefully through the increasingly complex passages. The currents shifted more noticeably here, creating miniature whirlpools and subtle vibrations in the sand. SpongeBob adjusted their steps accordingly, ensuring both stability and alignment with the map. After navigating several winding corridors, they reached a central chamber within the labyrinth. The space was larger than any previous chamber, with tall coral walls forming a near-complete circle around them. Sunlight filtered through gaps above, casting a soft glow across the sand and highlighting intricate coral patterns. SpongeBob and Patrick moved carefully across the floor, observing subtle depressions and markings that corresponded to the map's symbols. The chamber felt like a natural hub, a central point from which multiple passages branched outward. The central chamber contained small alcoves with unusual coral formations, creating natural points of reference. SpongeBob examined each alcove, noting how they aligned with the map and the surrounding corridors. Patrick explored in parallel, discovering minor features and adjusting their position accordingly. The combination of methodical observation and natural exploration reinforced their confidence in navigating the labyrinth's complexities. Exiting the central chamber, they entered the final stretch of the coral labyrinth. The corridors here were narrower and more tightly packed, requiring careful attention to every step. SpongeBob led the way, testing each ridge and adjusting their path to maintain stability. Patrick followed closely, mirroring SpongeBob's movements and observing subtle cues in the sand and coral. The air of anticipation grew with each step as the labyrinth was nearing its end and the next major landmark approached. The final corridor twisted gently upward, creating a slight incline. SpongeBob moved deliberately, feeling the shift in sand underfoot and adjusting Patrick's position to prevent slips. Currents flowed alongside them, creating soft ripples that added to the labyrinth's sense of life and subtle movement. Patrick's curiosity remained high, but he maintained focus on SpongeBob's guidance, understanding the importance of coordination in this critical stage. Emerging from the last corridor, SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into a small open space filled with scattered coral and smooth sand. Sunlight poured through the water above, illuminating the terrain and highlighting features indicated on the map. SpongeBob paused, taking a moment to observe the surrounding area and confirm their alignment. Patrick looked around, eyes wide with excitement and anticipation, recognizing that they had successfully navigated the labyrinth. The exit from the coral labyrinth marked another milestone in their journey. SpongeBob and Patrick had traversed intricate passages, twisting corridors and central chambers, using careful observation, teamwork, and map guidance to reach this point. The experience had strengthened their confidence and prepared them for the next stage of the adventure, where new challenges and discoveries awaited. Together, they stepped forward into the open area beyond, ready to continue the pursuit of the treasure hidden deep within Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob and Patrick moved forward from the exit of the coral labyrinth into a new stretch of underwater terrain. The landscape unfolded into a vast area known as the rippled reef, where gently rolling sand formations mixed with clusters of delicate coral branches. The sand was marked by long, flowing ridges, creating natural pathways that meandered through the reef. SpongeBob studied the map, noting that this region was critical for maintaining alignment with the hidden treasure's route. Patrick followed closely, his attention drawn to the intricate shapes of the coral and the subtle shifts of the sand beneath their feet. The currents in the rippled reef were soft but persistent, brushing gently against SpongeBob and Patrick as they navigated the sand waves. Each step required careful observation. The ridges could hide depressions that might shift unexpectedly. SpongeBob adjusted his pace to account for these subtleties, testing the stability of each step before advancing. Patrick mimicked his movements, occasionally pausing to observe small patterns in the sand created by tiny fish and shifting water. The interplay of attention and natural curiosity guided them through the delicate terrain. The reef itself was alive with small marine activity. Tiny creatures moved along the sand ridges, leaving subtle impressions in their wake. SpongeBob noted these markings, using them as natural indicators of currents and sand shifts. Patrick, fascinated by the movement, traced some of the paths lightly with his fingers, learning to interpret the environmental cues. Together, they moved through the area with a blend of deliberate focus and exploratory engagement, using both observation and instinct to navigate effectively. As they advanced deeper into the rippled reef, the sand ridges became more pronounced. The gentle slopes occasionally rose into small peaks, forming natural platforms that offered better vantage points for assessing the surroundings. SpongeBob led the way to one such peak, stepping carefully across the shifting surface. From this elevated position, he could see the larger structure of the reef ahead. Clusters of coral interspersed with flowing sand valleys, forming a complex network of natural pathways. Patrick climbed beside him, marveling at the view and taking in the expanse of undulating formations. The map indicated that the hidden path would wind through the densest part of the rippled reef, requiring navigation through tighter spaces and over more pronounced ridges. SpongeBob adjusted their route accordingly, selecting pathways that offered stability while maintaining alignment with the map's symbols. Patrick followed closely, stepping carefully over ridges and through small channels. Each movement required attention to the subtle shifts in sand and the direction of currents, blending observation with balance and coordination. Scattered coral structures provided both obstacles and guidance. Some clusters formed narrow corridors, while others created natural alcoves that served as markers along the path. SpongeBob paused frequently to study the features, comparing their positions with the map and ensuring that they remained on course. Patrick explored each cluster briefly, noticing textures and patterns that reinforced SpongeBob's understanding of the terrain. The reef offered countless subtle clues, and careful observation allowed them to navigate without error. Currents flowed irregularly through the reef, creating small ripples and eddies along the sand ridges. SpongeBob observed these shifts carefully, using them to anticipate changes in footing and select the most stable routes. Patrick reached down occasionally to watch the sand and bubbles swirl, fascinated by the gentle movement. SpongeBob recognized that these currents were natural guides, and paying attention to their patterns ensured steady progress through the intricate reef landscape. After moving through several ridges and coral clusters, they reached a small open area within the rippled reef. The sand was smoother here, and scattered coral branches created a natural clearing. SpongeBob paused to examine the map and cross-reference their position with the surrounding features. Patrick moved slowly across the clearing, exploring small depressions and subtle ridges, his curiosity aiding their navigation. The clearing served as a checkpoint, confirming that they were still following the correct path. Exiting the clearing, the ridges grew taller and the sand slopes steeper. SpongeBob guided Patrick carefully, testing each step for stability and ensuring that they did not disturb the delicate formations. The map indicated a series of minor obstacles ahead, small coral protrusions interspersed along the sand waves. SpongeBob navigated these obstacles with precision, stepping lightly over the ridges and guiding Patrick through narrow gaps. Patrick followed closely, adjusting his movements to match SpongeBob's deliberate pace. The rippled reef contained occasional hidden alcoves, shallow indentations in the sand partially obscured by coral branches. SpongeBob examined these alcoves, noting how each aligned with subtle symbols on the map. Patrick explored them briefly, observing textures and patterns that helped reinforce SpongeBob's understanding of the terrain. These alcoves served as natural markers, providing reassurance that their navigation remained accurate and aligned with the treasure route. As they progressed, the sand ridges became less uniform, forming irregular waves that required careful attention to each step. SpongeBob adjusted their pace, guiding Patrick over steeper inclines and around deeper depressions. Currents shifted more noticeably in these areas, creating subtle instability in the sand surface. SpongeBob tested each step before advancing, ensuring both his and Patrick's safety. Patrick adapted quickly, learning to anticipate shifts and move with balance, following SpongeBob's lead. Midway through the rippled reef, they reached a larger open area dotted with prominent coral mounds. The map indicated that this was a critical section, a transition zone leading toward the next landmark. SpongeBob carefully assessed the terrain, noting the locations of the mounds and the subtle patterns of the sand ridges. Patrick moved through the area with fascination, occasionally touching the coral surfaces and observing small sea creatures. Their combined observation allowed them to navigate efficiently, maintaining alignment with the map while appreciating the intricacies of the reef. The open area contained small currents that flowed irregularly, creating gentle, swirling patterns in the sand. SpongeBob observed these movements, using them to anticipate changes in footing and to guide Patrick safely. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's careful movements, learning to interpret the subtle environmental cues. Together, they moved through the transition zone with coordinated precision, maintaining a steady rhythm and avoiding potential pitfalls. Exiting the open area, the terrain of the rippled reef became slightly more structured, with defined ridges and smaller coral clusters forming natural pathways. SpongeBob led the way, testing each step and guiding Patrick along the safest route. The map indicated that they were approaching the next major feature, a series of interlocking coral towers rising above the sand. SpongeBob recognized these towers as the entrance to the next stage of their journey, signaling a shift from the rippled reef into a more complex and challenging environment. Patrick's excitement grew as they neared the towers, but he remained attentive to SpongeBob's guidance. The experience in the rippled reef had strengthened their ability to observe, anticipate, and coordinate movements. Each ridge, alcove, and subtle current had prepared them for the increased complexity ahead. SpongeBob adjusted his pace, leading Patrick toward the first cluster of towers while noting reference points along the way. Patrick followed, stepping carefully across the ridges and navigating between coral formations. The first tower cluster marked a clear transition. The sand beneath their feet was firmer, and the coral structures rose taller, casting long shadows across the terrain. SpongeBob paused briefly to confirm alignment with the map, observing the positions of the towers relative to the sand ridges. Patrick mirrored his movements, adjusting steps and observing subtle features in the surrounding environment. Together, they stepped fully into the next region, leaving the rippled reef behind and preparing for the challenges of the coral spires that lay ahead. The journey across the rippled reef had tested their observation, balance, and patience. Each step required careful attention to subtle details in the terrain, currents, and coral formations. SpongeBob and Patrick emerged from the region with greater confidence, a stronger sense of coordination, and anticipation for the discoveries that awaited them in the next stage. The treasure was still ahead, and the rippled reef had proven to be both a challenge and a guide, preparing them for the complex path that remained. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into the coral spires, where towering coral formations rose sharply from the sand, their jagged peaks piercing through shafts of sunlight that filtered down through the water. The landscape was both mesmerizing and intimidating, a labyrinth of natural towers and narrow passages. SpongeBob consulted the map, noting the winding pathways that threaded between the spires. Each passage promised both discovery and challenge, requiring careful attention to detail, patience, and coordination between the two friends. The sand beneath their feet was uneven, with steep ridges and shallow depressions formed by shifting currents. SpongeBob moved deliberately, testing each step for stability before committing his weight. Patrick followed closely, mimicking SpongeBob's movements while occasionally pausing to examine small details in the coral structures. The spires themselves were textured and layered, some smooth and polished by years of water flow, while others were jagged, their edges rough with algae and small marine growths. Each spire seemed unique, serving as both obstacle and marker along the journey. As they advanced deeper into the coral spires, the passages between the towers became narrower, forcing SpongeBob and Patrick to adjust their paths carefully. SpongeBob guided Patrick through each gap, noting subtle changes in the width and slope of the sand beneath their feet. Patrick followed obediently, stepping lightly to maintain balance and avoid disturbing the delicate formations. The interplay of shadows and sunlight created constantly shifting patterns on the sand and coral, adding to the complexity of navigation. Small currents flowed through the spires, swirling gently around the bases of the towers. SpongeBob observed these movements, using them to anticipate changes in footing and adjust their path accordingly. Patrick reached down occasionally to watch the sand ripple and swirl, fascinated by the delicate patterns. Together, they navigated the currents with precision, blending observation and intuition to maintain alignment with the map. The passages twisted and turned, forming natural corridors that led deeper into the heart of the spire region. SpongeBob paused at intervals to examine reference points, comparing the formations with the symbols on the map. Patrick explored nearby alcoves, noticing textures and patterns that reinforced their orientation. The combination of SpongeBob's careful analysis and Patrick's instinctive observation allowed them to move steadily through the intricate network of spires. Midway through the region, they encountered a series of particularly tall spires clustered closely together. The corridors between them were narrow, requiring precise foot placement and careful balance. SpongeBob led the way, adjusting each step to account for subtle shifts in sand and small protrusions in the coral walls. Patrick followed closely, learning to anticipate these changes and maintain coordination with SpongeBob's pace. Each step was deliberate, ensuring that they remained aligned with the intended path. The spires contained occasional open spaces and small chambers formed by natural arrangements of coral. These areas offered brief relief from the narrow passages but also demanded careful observation. SpongeBob examined the floors and walls for subtle markings, depressions, and alignments that matched the map. Patrick explored the chambers, noting unusual textures and patterns, often pointing out details that SpongeBob incorporated into his navigation plan. Together, they maintained a balance of observation and movement, ensuring continued progress through the region. As they advanced, the spires began to form natural arches and bridges overhead. SpongeBob adjusted their path to move safely beneath these features, ensuring Patrick could follow without risk of dislodging coral fragments. The play of light filtering through gaps in the formations created moving patterns that danced across the sand. SpongeBob noted these patterns as additional reference points, reinforcing the alignment with the map. Patrick followed attentively, learning to recognize environmental cues as guides through the maze-like terrain. Deeper into the coral spires, the corridors narrowed further, requiring even more precise navigation. SpongeBob tested each ridge in the sand before stepping, signaling Patrick to follow carefully. Currents occasionally shifted small particles along the pathways, subtly altering the surface and creating minor challenges for balance. Patrick adapted quickly, following SpongeBob's lead while observing the sand and coral for cues. Their coordination allowed them to move efficiently, despite the increasing complexity of the spire network. The passages contained small alcoves filled with tiny shells and marine life. SpongeBob paused to examine these features, noting their positions relative to the map and using them as markers for orientation. Patrick explored the alcoves lightly, observing textures and currents that reinforced SpongeBob's understanding of the terrain. These subtle features acted as both guides and checkpoints, confirming that their navigation remained accurate. As they progressed, the spires became taller and more imposing, creating narrow, vertical corridors that funneled light and currents through the region. SpongeBob adjusted their movements, stepping carefully on ridges and avoiding loose sand. Patrick followed closely, maintaining alignment and observing subtle changes in the terrain. Each corridor required full attention, but the teamwork between them allowed steady advancement without mistakes. Midway through the spire region, SpongeBob noticed a distinct change in the color and texture of the coral. The map indicated that these variations marked the approach to a significant feature within the spires. SpongeBob slowed their pace, guiding Patrick carefully and adjusting movements to account for shifting currents. The subtle changes in terrain served as natural cues, signaling that they were nearing the next milestone of their journey. After navigating several twisting corridors, they reached a central cluster of spires that formed a natural amphitheater-like structure. Sunlight filtered through gaps above, casting soft, shifting patterns on the sand. SpongeBob and Patrick moved cautiously across the floor, observing depressions and subtle formations that matched symbols on the map. The amphitheater served as a natural hub from which multiple passages branched outward. SpongeBob noted each feature, ensuring alignment with the intended route. Exiting the central cluster, the corridors became slightly wider, allowing more freedom of movement. SpongeBob led Patrick through gently curving passages, maintaining attention on subtle ridges and changes in sand texture. Currents flowed softly along the corridors, creating faint ripples that indicated minor shifts in terrain. Patrick adjusted his steps accordingly, mirroring SpongeBob's careful pace. The interplay of observation, coordination, and intuition allowed them to navigate smoothly toward the far edge of the coral spires. The final stretch of the region consisted of a series of narrow ridges flanked by tall spires. SpongeBob tested each step, moving deliberately to ensure balance. Patrick followed closely, adjusting to subtle shifts and observing environmental cues. The map indicated that the exit from the coral spires was near, signaling a transition to the next stage of their adventure. SpongeBob felt a surge of anticipation, knowing that each successful step had brought them closer to the treasure. Patrick's energy mirrored SpongeBob's determination, tempered by the careful focus required to navigate the delicate terrain. Emerging from the last corridor, SpongeBob and Patrick stepped into an open area with scattered coral mounds and gently rippling sand. Sunlight flooded the space, illuminating the path ahead. SpongeBob paused to confirm alignment with the map, while Patrick looked around in awe at the towering spires they had just traversed. The experience had tested their observation, coordination, and patience, but it had also strengthened their teamwork and confidence. Together, they stepped fully into the new region, prepared for the next stage of their adventure. The coral spires had proven to be both a challenge and a guide. Each corridor, alcove, and ridge had demanded careful attention, blending observation with instinct. SpongeBob and Patrick emerged with greater confidence, ready to face the next stage where new discoveries and hidden secrets awaited. The treasure lay ahead, and the coral spires had been a vital step toward reaching it, sharpening their skills and deepening their connection as explorers. SpongeBob and Patrick moved beyond the coral spires, stepping into a new underwater environment known as the Sunken Garden. The landscape unfolded like a hidden oasis, with dense clusters of colorful coral, tall seaweed swaying gently with the currents, and sand patterned with intricate ripples. The area had an air of quiet mystery, its beauty both inviting and slightly intimidating. SpongeBob consulted the map, noting that this region was marked as a critical waypoint on their path to the treasure. Patrick, full of curiosity, glanced around eagerly, captivated by the vibrant hues and unusual formations surrounding them. The sand beneath their feet was soft but uneven, with subtle depressions and ridges shaped by the movement of water. SpongeBob adjusted his steps carefully, testing each area for stability before moving forward. Patrick followed closely, stepping lightly and observing the small marine life scattered across the floor. Tiny fish darted through the coral, leaving delicate trails in the sand. SpongeBob noted these movements, using them as indicators of current patterns and potential obstacles. Patrick, fascinated by the intricate dance of life, paused occasionally to watch, adding a sense of wonder to their careful navigation. As they advanced deeper into the sunken garden, the density of coral and seaweed increased. Narrow corridors formed between towering coral structures, requiring SpongeBob and Patrick to maneuver with precision. SpongeBob led the way, adjusting his path to account for subtle variations in terrain and ensuring Patrick could follow safely. The tall seaweed created natural walls that swayed gently with the currents, partially obscuring the path ahead. SpongeBob studied the map closely, identifying the sequence of formations they needed to follow to stay on course. The garden was alive with activity. Small crabs scuttled along the sand and tiny seahorses floated through the water, weaving between coral branches. SpongeBob paused to observe a cluster of translucent jellyfish drifting through the garden, their soft glow reflecting across the sand. Patrick watched in amazement, occasionally reaching out to touch the water as the creatures passed by. SpongeBob used these moments to note environmental cues, understanding that each feature could act as a natural marker to guide their progress through the sunken garden. The terrain required careful attention. Certain areas contained depressions or unstable sand ridges that could shift underfoot. SpongeBob led Patrick around these spots, testing each step before advancing. Currents occasionally flowed in unpredictable patterns, moving sand and small shells along the floor. SpongeBob observed these subtle movements, using them to anticipate changes in footing and select the most stable path. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's movements, learning to sense the patterns of currents and terrain, and adjusting his steps accordingly. As they moved further, the sunken garden opened into a broader section filled with a dense arrangement of coral formations and tall seaweed towers. SpongeBob guided Patrick carefully, moving between clusters and avoiding areas where the sand appeared loose or disturbed. The sunlight filtering from above created shifting patterns across the garden, highlighting ridges in the sand and contours in the coral. SpongeBob studied these patterns, aligning them with the map to ensure they were following the intended route. Patrick, fascinated by the interplay of light and shadow, continued to observe while staying close to SpongeBob. The garden contained small natural chambers formed by coral arches and dense seaweed clusters. These chambers provided brief respite from the winding corridors, but navigating them still required attention. SpongeBob examined the floor and walls of each chamber for subtle signs, depressions, and alignments that corresponded with the map. Patrick explored cautiously, observing textures, small creatures, and water flow. Each observation reinforced SpongeBob's understanding of the terrain and confirmed that they remained on course. Midway through the sunken garden, they encountered a section where coral and seaweed interwove to form narrow passages. SpongeBob led Patrick carefully, adjusting their steps to maintain balance and avoid dislodging fragile structures. Currents moved gently through the corridors, creating subtle ripples and shifting particles of sand. SpongeBob observed these flows, using them to anticipate the stability of each step. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's movements, learning to interpret environmental cues and maintain coordination. The map indicated that the hidden path would wind through the densest part of the garden, a zone with tightly packed coral towers and high concentrations of seaweed. SpongeBob guided Patrick cautiously, stepping carefully over ridges and through narrow gaps. The combination of visual cues from the environment and reference points on the map ensured steady progress. Patrick observed closely, occasionally pointing out unusual features that aligned with SpongeBob's navigation, reinforcing their teamwork. The sunken garden contained small alcoves and pockets within the coral, some housing tiny shells and other marine life. SpongeBob examined these areas, using them as markers for orientation and to verify alignment with the map. Patrick explored in parallel, noting textures and minor currents that provided additional guidance. Each observation added to their understanding of the intricate terrain, allowing them to navigate without error. As they advanced, SpongeBob noticed a subtle change in the color and texture of the coral, signaling the approach to a significant feature within the garden. The map confirmed that this was a key transition point, marking the next stage of their journey. SpongeBob slowed their pace, guiding Patrick carefully and ensuring alignment with the path. Currents shifted slightly more strongly in this area, requiring delicate balance and careful observation. Patrick followed closely, mirroring SpongeBob's movements and maintaining steady coordination. After navigating the intricate passages and alcoves, they emerged into a central clearing within the sunken garden. The space was larger and more open, with tall coral towers surrounding the area like guardians. Sunlight filtered through gaps above, casting dappled patterns across the sand. SpongeBob paused to examine the terrain, noting depressions, ridges, and natural markers that aligned with the map. Patrick moved through the clearing with curiosity, exploring small coral clusters and observing the vibrant marine life. The central clearing acted as a natural hub, confirming their position and progress. The currents in the clearing flowed gently, creating subtle ripples across the sand and around coral formations. SpongeBob studied these movements, using them to anticipate changes in footing and identify the safest paths through the open space. Patrick observed alongside him, learning to interpret the patterns and maintain coordination. Together, they moved across the clearing with careful precision, ensuring both safety and alignment with the map. Exiting the central clearing, the sunken garden gradually transitioned into an area with smaller coral formations and lower seaweed concentrations. The sand ridges became more regular and the pathways clearer. SpongeBob led Patrick through this transition zone, stepping lightly over ridges and around minor depressions. The map indicated that they were approaching the boundary of the garden where the next region awaited. Patrick followed closely, his excitement tempered by the care required to navigate the remaining terrain. The final stretch of the sunken garden contained scattered coral mounds and gentle ridges in the sand. SpongeBob tested each step, ensuring stability and avoiding disturbances. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's movements, maintaining attention to subtle changes in the terrain. Sunlight poured from above, illuminating the path and highlighting features indicated on the map. Each step brought them closer to the next stage, a new region promising further challenges and discoveries. Emerging from the sunken garden, SpongeBob and Patrick paused briefly to take in the view. The dense coral clusters and swaying seaweed had given way to a more open expanse, signaling the approach to the next landmark. SpongeBob observed the transition carefully, noting reference points and aligning them with the map. Patrick looked around with wide-eyed wonder, recognizing the beauty and complexity of the garden they had just traversed. The experience had strengthened their observation skills, coordination, and teamwork, preparing them for the journey ahead. The sunken garden had tested their attention to detail, patience, and ability to navigate complex terrain. Each ridge, alcove, and passage had provided both challenge and guidance, reinforcing the importance of careful observation and collaboration. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped fully into the open expanse beyond, ready to continue toward the treasure and face the next stage of their adventure with confidence and anticipation. SpongeBob and Patrick moved forward from the sunken garden into a sparkling new region marked on the map as the Glimmering Lagoon. The water here shimmered with filtered sunlight, reflecting off patches of sand and coral, creating a kaleidoscope of moving light patterns. The lagoon surface was dotted with small coral mounds and occasional gentle waves of sand beneath, hinting at the subtle currents flowing through the area. SpongeBob paused to observe the layout, tracing the path on the map while Patrick's eyes widened with excitement at the beauty of the scene around them. The sand was smooth, but occasionally interrupted by slight ridges and shallow depressions, requiring careful steps to maintain balance. SpongeBob tested each movement, adjusting for the currents that occasionally brushed against their legs and shifted small particles of sand. Patrick followed closely, stepping lightly and observing the ripples forming around coral mounds. The interplay of light, sand, and coral created a constantly shifting visual environment, demanding attention and observation to maintain orientation. As they progressed deeper into the lagoon, the landscape became more intricate. Coral mounds grew taller and more irregular, forming natural corridors between them. SpongeBob led the way, carefully adjusting their route to ensure safe passage and alignment with the map. Patrick mirrored each movement, stepping carefully across the sand ridges and occasionally pausing to examine small marine creatures that darted among the coral. The lagoon was alive with activity, and each observation provided both guidance and inspiration for their journey. The currents within the lagoon were soft but persistent, creating subtle swirls that moved sand and small shells across the floor. SpongeBob noted these flows, using them to anticipate changes in terrain and adjust steps accordingly. Patrick reached down occasionally to watch the tiny whirlpools form, fascinated by the patterns. Together, they navigated the area with a mix of careful observation and instinctive movement, maintaining their path while absorbing the lagoon's beauty. The Glimmering Lagoon contained several open spaces interspersed among the coral mounds. These areas allowed a brief respite from narrow passages but also required careful attention. SpongeBob examined the floors and walls for subtle cues, depressions, ridges, and color variations in the sand and coral that aligned with the map. Patrick explored lightly, observing textures and currents, adding an extra layer of environmental awareness to their journey. Together, they maintained steady progress, using both observation and intuition. Deeper into the lagoon, the coral structures became more intricate, forming small arches and natural bridges overhead. SpongeBob led Patrick carefully beneath these features, noting the patterns in the sand that indicated safe footing. The sunlight, filtering through the water, created shifting patterns across the lagoon floor, highlighting subtle changes in elevation and texture. Patrick watched these patterns with fascination, occasionally pausing to point out interesting formations that SpongeBob incorporated into his navigation plan. The map indicated that the hidden path would weave through the densest section of the lagoon, a region with tightly packed coral mounds and subtle sand ridges. SpongeBob adjusted their route to account for the complex terrain, moving deliberately through narrow gaps and over uneven surfaces. Patrick followed closely, stepping carefully and observing environmental cues to maintain alignment with SpongeBob's lead. Each step was a balance of precision and curiosity, blending observation with the joy of exploration. Small alcoves and pockets within the coral provided natural markers and resting points. SpongeBob examined these features, noting how each aligned with the map's symbols. Patrick explored parallel areas, observing textures, currents, and small marine life. The combination of their observations reinforced accurate navigation through the lagoon, allowing them to move forward without hesitation. The gentle shimmer of sunlight across the sand and coral added an ethereal quality, making the area feel both magical and alive. As they advanced, SpongeBob noticed subtle changes in the sand and coral coloration, signaling the approach to a significant landmark within the lagoon. The map confirmed that this point marked the next stage of their journey. SpongeBob slowed their pace, guiding Patrick carefully through a series of narrow ridges and small gaps between coral mounds. Currents shifted gently but more noticeably here, requiring delicate balance and steady observation. Patrick adjusted quickly, following SpongeBob's lead and remaining attentive to the changing environment. After navigating the tighter passages, they emerged into a larger, open section of the lagoon. The sand here was smooth, and sunlight poured through the water, creating a dazzling display of light across the floor. Coral mounds surrounded the open space, forming natural boundaries while allowing visibility of multiple paths ahead. SpongeBob paused to examine the terrain, noting depressions, ridges, and formations that corresponded with the map. Patrick moved with awe and careful attention, exploring the area while maintaining alignment with SpongeBob's guidance. The currents flowed softly across the open section, creating subtle ripples and shifting small shells along the sand. SpongeBob observed these flows, using them to anticipate changes in footing and choose the safest paths. Patrick followed, stepping lightly and interpreting the movements around him. Their teamwork allowed steady progress, combining SpongeBob's careful analysis with Patrick's intuitive perception of the environment. Emerging from the central area, they encountered a series of smaller coral mounds, forming a corridor leading toward the far edge of the lagoon. SpongeBob led the way, navigating narrow passages and gently sloping ridges. Patrick mirrored each step, moving with precision and observing the shifting sand and coral surfaces. The sunlight above highlighted subtle textures and color changes, guiding them toward the intended route. Midway through the corridor, SpongeBob noted distinctive markings in the sand and coral formations that served as key reference points from the map. These natural features reinforced their position and progress, ensuring they remained on course. Patrick observed carefully, occasionally pointing out details that SpongeBob incorporated into their navigation. Each small feature served as both guidance and reassurance, confirming their successful traversal through the intricate lagoon terrain. As they advanced, the corridors opened into smaller chambers and alcoves within the coral. SpongeBob examined the floors and walls, noting subtle depressions and alignments with the map. Patrick explored lightly, observing currents, textures, and marine life. The combination of methodical observation and intuitive exploration allowed them to navigate efficiently, maintaining both orientation and safety. The final stretch of the glimmering lagoon consisted of a series of gently sloping sand ridges interspersed with coral clusters. SpongeBob tested each step, ensuring stability and alignment with the map. Patrick followed closely, adapting to subtle shifts and observing environmental cues. The sunlight above illuminated the path, highlighting natural markers and guiding their movement. Each step brought them closer to the next stage, building anticipation for what lay ahead. Emerging from the last corridor, SpongeBob and Patrick paused briefly to take in the view. The glimmering lagoon stretched behind them, its beauty and complexity leaving a lasting impression. SpongeBob confirmed their alignment with the map, noting reference points for the next region. Patrick looked around with wonder, recognizing the challenge and the achievement of traversing the lagoon successfully. Their observation, coordination, and patience had carried them through this radiant environment, preparing them for the final stage before the treasure. The glimmering lagoon had been both a challenge and a guide, testing their skills and reinforcing their teamwork. Each step, ridge, and alcove had demanded careful attention, observation, and coordination. SpongeBob and Patrick stepped forward confidently, ready to continue their journey into the next region where the treasure was drawing ever closer. SpongeBob and Patrick moved beyond the glimmering lagoon, stepping into the final stretch of their journey. The terrain opened into a broad underwater expanse, a combination of smooth sand plains, scattered coral mounds, and clusters of seaweed. The map indicated that the hidden treasure was close, and the air of anticipation was palpable. SpongeBob felt a heightened sense of focus, carefully observing each feature of the terrain. Patrick's eyes widened with excitement, yet he followed SpongeBob's lead, understanding that precision and attention were essential at this stage. The sand beneath them was mostly even but dotted with occasional ridges and depressions. SpongeBob tested each step before committing, ensuring stability. Currents flowed gently across the plains, shifting small particles of sand and shells. Patrick mirrored SpongeBob's movements, learning to interpret the subtle shifts in the sand and water currents. Together, they moved steadily forward, maintaining awareness of the environment and the map's indications for the treasure's location. Scattered coral mounds formed natural markers across the sand plains. SpongeBob paused at each mound, comparing its shape and position with symbols on the map. Patrick explored the spaces between the mounds, observing textures and small marine life. Each coral formation provided reassurance that they were on the correct path. The area seemed calm, but SpongeBob remained attentive, knowing that subtle details could reveal hidden pitfalls or important landmarks guiding them toward the treasure. As they moved further, the terrain became slightly more uneven, with larger ridges and occasional depressions. SpongeBob adjusted their pace accordingly, leading Patrick through the safest routes. Currents created small ripples across the sand, highlighting areas that might require extra care. Patrick watched the patterns closely, learning to anticipate shifts in footing and follow SpongeBob's precise movements. Their teamwork was seamless, combining SpongeBob's analytical approach with Patrick's attentive curiosity. Midway through the final expanse, they approached a series of larger coral formations that marked the entrance to a shallow depression in the sand. The map indicated that this area was critical, likely the location of the hidden treasure. SpongeBob moved carefully, examining the contours of the sand and the placement of the coral. Patrick followed closely, stepping lightly, and observing each subtle detail. Together, they identified a slightly sunken area between the coral, its edges obscured by scattered shells and small rocks. The depression's shape and position matched the map's markings perfectly. SpongeBob signaled to Patrick to approach slowly. They moved to the edge of the sunken area, noting the surrounding coral clusters and the gentle slopes of sand leading down. Currents shifted slightly as they stepped closer, creating miniature swirls of sand and tiny bubbles. SpongeBob examined the depression carefully, noting subtle irregularities that hinted at a concealed object beneath. Patrick mirrored his movements, leaning forward slightly to observe the same details and anticipate the next steps. They began to explore the depression systematically. SpongeBob traced his fingers along the sand surface, moving shells and small debris aside with careful precision. Patrick followed closely, assisting in uncovering hidden sections while remaining attentive to SpongeBob's lead. The sunken area gradually revealed a small chest partially buried beneath layers of sand and fine shells. SpongeBob noted the alignment of the chest with the map, confirming that they had found the correct location. Patrick's excitement grew visibly, though he maintained focus as SpongeBob carefully cleared the remaining sand around the chest. The chest was unremarkable at first glance, made of weathered wood and reinforced with coral-like bindings. SpongeBob examined its structure, noting the stability of the surrounding sand and ensuring that no currents could destabilize it during the uncovering. Patrick assisted in gently moving debris away, revealing more of the chest's surface. The moment was charged with anticipation, the culmination of their long journey through labyrinths, reefs, gardens, and lagoons. With the chest fully revealed, SpongeBob and Patrick prepared to open it. The lid was slightly stiff from years of submersion and natural deposits. SpongeBob applied careful pressure, lifting the lid slowly, while Patrick supported the movement to maintain balance. As the chest creaked open, a faint glimmer emerged from within, catching the filtered sunlight and reflecting across the sand and coral. The treasure inside was partially obscured, but its sparkle was unmistakable, signaling the successful completion of their quest. The chest contained a collection of objects that radiated color and light, pearls, gemstones, and small artifacts intricately carved and polished by the currents over time. SpongeBob and Patrick leaned forward, observing the treasure in awe. Each piece reflected the surrounding light differently, creating a mesmerizing display. Patrick's excitement was evident, though he maintained focus, moving cautiously around the chest. SpongeBob studied each object, noting its placement and the way it fit naturally within the sunken chest. The treasure was both beautiful and mysterious, a reward for the careful navigation and perseverance that had guided them to this point. Beyond the tangible treasure, SpongeBob and Patrick felt a deeper sense of achievement. They recognized the magnitude of the journey itself, the careful observation, the coordination, and the patience required to navigate labyrinths, reefs, gardens, and lagoons. Each stage had challenged them in different ways, strengthening their skills and their teamwork. The treasure was a tangible reward, but the adventure and the growth it had inspired were equally significant. After a long moment of appreciation, SpongeBob and Patrick began to explore the surrounding area near the chest. Small alcoves and ridges around the depression contained minor treasures of their own: tiny shells, polished stones, and intricate coral formations. SpongeBob noted these features while Patrick moved from one to another with fascination, learning to interpret subtle cues in the terrain. The sunken area had revealed multiple layers of discovery, extending beyond the main treasure to the richness of the environment itself. The currents around the chest were gentle, flowing softly across the sand and coral. SpongeBob and Patrick observed the movements carefully, understanding that the environment had been shaped over time to protect and conceal the treasure. Each ripple and subtle shift in sand reinforced the idea that the journey had been as much about understanding the underwater world as it had been about locating the chest. Patrick's curiosity remained high, and SpongeBob guided him to observe details he might have missed, reinforcing their collaborative approach. As they explored, the sunlight filtered through the water, cast in shimmering patterns across the treasure and the surrounding sand. SpongeBob traced these patterns with his eyes, noting the interplay of light, color, and reflection. Patrick followed, moving alongside SpongeBob and absorbing the beauty of the moment. The glimmering lagoon, the sunken garden, the coral spires, and the rippled reef all seemed to converge in this final scene, each environment contributing to the richness of their adventure. With the treasure fully uncovered, SpongeBob and Patrick paused to reflect on their journey. They had navigated hidden passages, complex labyrinths, delicate reefs, and vibrant gardens. Each stage had required careful observation, balance, and patience, and each had provided both challenge and guidance. The chest was the tangible reward, but the experiences and skills gained along the way were equally valuable. Patrick moved beside SpongeBob, sharing a silent acknowledgement of the accomplishment, and the bond strengthened through the journey. After a final inspection of the chest and the surrounding sand, SpongeBob and Patrick prepared to leave the depression. They moved carefully, maintaining stability on the ridges and observing subtle currents. Patrick occasionally paused to take in the treasure, still captivated by its beauty. SpongeBob guided him gently, ensuring a safe and coordinated exit. The journey back through the sunken area was calmer than the approach, with the excitement of discovery replaced by a sense of fulfillment and reflection. Emerging from the sunken depression, SpongeBob and Patrick looked back at the treasure, its glimmer fading slightly in the distance but remaining vivid in their memory. The surrounding terrain, the sand ridges, coral clusters, and gentle currents now felt familiar, marked by the steps and observations they had made throughout the journey. Each stage of the adventure, from labyrinths to reefs to gardens and lagoons, had prepared them for this moment, culminating in the discovery of the hidden treasure. As they moved toward open water beyond the treasure site, SpongeBob and Patrick carried with them not only the physical chest, but also the memory of an extraordinary adventure. The journey had tested their skills, strengthened their teamwork, and revealed the hidden beauty of Bikini Bottom. The treasure was a reward, yes, but the experience, the careful observation, the coordination, the perseverance was the true prize. Patrick looked around, eyes bright with wonder, and SpongeBob nodded subtly, both acknowledging that this adventure was one they would remember forever. The final steps of their journey brought them into calm, open water, where sunlight streamed clearly and currents flowed gently. SpongeBob and Patrick paused to take in the view, reflecting silently on the challenges they had overcome and the discoveries they had made. The treasure lay behind them, a symbol of success and perseverance, while the path ahead suggested the possibility of future adventures. Both friends understood that this journey had changed them, deepening their skills, their curiosity, and their bond. With the hidden treasure secured and their adventure complete, SpongeBob and Patrick swam side by side, moving toward the open reaches of Bikini Bottom. The journey had tested every aspect of observation, patience, and teamwork, but it had also offered beauty, wonder, and the thrill of discovery. Each step of the journey had been a lesson, each challenge an opportunity, and each moment an adventure in its own right. As they continued forward, the treasure behind them and the open ocean ahead, SpongeBob and Patrick knew that the adventure would live on in memory and in the promise of future quests waiting just beyond the horizon.